Chapter 22 of My Opinions and Betsey Bobbet's by Mrs. Josiah Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Meet Dr. Mary Walker. No cambric needle ever had its eye sought any keener and firmer into the North Pole than Josiah Allen's wife had her keen eye aimed at the good of the human race. So I thought I would go and see Horace first. But Jonathan Beans's ex-wife told me he had gone away for the day to some great rally in a neighborin' village. I didn't have the least idee what she meant by rally, but I answered her in a bland way that I hoped he would have good luck and get quite a mess of it. And then says I, it won't make a mite of difference with me, I can go to Miss Woodhull's first. Betsey was rampant to go to the theatre, Barnum's amusement, and the centre of the park, and some of the meetin' houses with big steeples, and other places of amusement. But I says to her, as we wended our way on, Betsey, these old bones of mine will repose in Jonesville to-morrow night, as the poet saith, in my own delightful feather bed. And Betsey, they couldn't rest there if they looked back and see that they didn't do all that they could while here for the advancement of the race and for improvin' of my own mind. Says I didn't come to this village for vain pleasure. I have got a high mission to perform about and a mind to improve upon. I thought we would just run in a few minutes to Miss Hooker's, but her hired girl says to me at the door, says she, Miss Hooker is engaged. I looked the hired girl full in the face, and says I, what of it? What if she is? Then says the hired girl, she hain't to home. Says I, why didn't you say so in the first out, and not go to beatin' round the bush? Says I, for I was determined to do all the good I could do to the human race, Miss Hooker is a first-rate woman, and it hain't a hired girl's place to talk about her mistress's family matters and love affairs. When we got to Miss Woodhull's, we went up the front door steps, and I knocked to the door. Betsey says, ring the bell. Well, says I hain't particular, hand it along. I thought maybe she had got one in her pocket, and wanted me to ring it to pass away the time while we was standin' on the doorstep a-waitin' for Miss Woodhull to come and open the door. But Betsey reached by me and took holt of a little silver nub by the side of the door, put there for a ornament, and pulled it. Says I, don't be so impatient, Betsey. She'll be here in a minute. Don't go to foolin' and tearin' the house down to pass away time. Just at that minute a little black African came to the door. He looked impudent at us, and says he, Miss Woodhull hain't to home. And he shut the door right in our faces. We was just goin' down the doorsteps when the door opened again, and a little figure came out that at the first view baffled me. Says I to myself, is it a man or is it a woman? It had a woman's face, but a man's pantaloons. I was baffled. But Josiah Allen's wife hain't one to give up the ship while there is a half a plank left. I was determined to get all the knowledge I could while on my tower. I was determined to get information on every deep and mysterious subject I could. And so I walked up to it, and says I, in a low voice, and polite as I could, for fear of hurtin' its feelin's, be you a man, sir, or a wimmen, mum? It wasn't mad a bit. I say it, for I didn't know then in what gender to put it. It looked me so pleasant in the face, and yet so searchinly, that I was kinder flustrated, and says I, in a kind of awe-struck tone, I hope you won't be offended. I only ask for information. Be you a masculine, feminine, or neutral gender? It smiled again, just as pleasant as one of my glass jars of maple sugar, and then it opened its mouth and said, I am Dr. Mary Walker. I don't know when I have been so tickled. Nothin' is sweeter than knowledge to the inquirin' mind when it has been baffled. Says I, Mary, I am glad to see you. And I give her hand such a shakin' that it looked red as a beet when I let go. Says I am gladder to see you than I would be to see any nephew or niece I have got in the world. I am as glad to see you as I would be to see any brother or sister of mine. Says she, I cannot recall your countenance. Says I, Mary, I am Josiah Allen's wife. Oh, says she, I have read your eloquent orations on women's havin' a right. I am happy to make your acquaintance. Then and there I introduced Betsey. Says she, did you call to see Miss Woodhull? Yes, says I wanted to talk to her, for she is in the wrong, but she hain't to home. Says she is to home, and you shall see her. A few friends of the cause have met here to-day, but they are about all gone. She went right up the doorsteps again, and instead of knockin', she catched holt of that silver knob that Betsey had been a foolin' with. Mary was so excited that she didn't really know what she was about, or else she would have made some move toward gittin' into the house. But it was just as well, for that impudent-faced little black African happened to come to the door again just at the right time, and she spoke up kinder sharp-like. Show these ladies into the parlor. They are friends of mine, and Miss Woodhull will be glad to see 'em. He looked as if he would sink, and I didn't care if he did, clear through to the cellar. I should have been glad to have seen him sunk. I looked severe at him after I had gripped Mary's hand and parted with her. He held the door open awful polite, and in a kind of a apology way he muttered somethin' about "s'posen Miss Woodhull was engaged." Says I pretty sharp, "S'posen she is engaged, is that any reason you should turn Betsey and me outdoors?" Says I didn't keep our folks' doors locked up when I got engaged to Josiah. Says I, "S'posen Miss Woodhull is engaged, she ought to have been engaged and married years ago." I was in the wrong, and I see it, and catched holt of my principles convulsively, for I see that my indignant emotions toward that little lion imp was a shakin' 'em. I hadn't no right to be a speakin' against the woman of the house to their hired help. I felt as mean as Pewsly to think I had done it, and says I mildly, I am glad Miss Woodhull is engaged to be married. It takes a load offen my mind, says I. I presume she will settle down and make a real likely woman. At that minute a door opened right across the hall, and a man came out and shet it again, and he catched right hold of my arm, the first thing, and says he, "Come, Myrer Jane, or Myrer Ann," says he. "I can't really call to mind your precise name this minute, but I think it is Myrer anyway, or maybe it is Mary Ann. Come, Mary Ann, it is time to be a goin' home." I looked at him with almost fearful dignity, and I says to him with a air so cold that he must have thought it blowed off Greenland's icy mountain, "Let go of my arm." But he never bulged a inch, and I jest raised my umbrell, and says I, "If you don't let go of my arm, I'll make you let go." Then he let go, and he stood back a little, but he looked piercin'ly and searchin'ly into my face, and says he, "You are my wife, hain't you?" Then again I spoke with that fearful dignity, and that cold and icy air, 50 degrees under Mr. Zero it was, if it was a degree. "No, sir! I am proud and happy to say I am not your wife. I am Josiah Allen's wife." He looked real meechin', and says he, "I beg your pardon, mum, but I've only been married to my last wife a few hours, haven't got a divorce from a former companion after dinner yesterday, and I have been so busy since that I haven't really got the run of her face yet, though I thought," he added dreamily, "that I should know that nose again anywhere." I see he was imposin' on me, but I wasn't goin' to have my nose throwed in my face by him, and says I am aware that my nose is a pretty sizable one, but, says I, in about as sarcastic a voice as I ever used in my life, it is a nose that hain't never been wore off, and made smaller a pokin' into other folks' affairs. Pokin' round a tryin' to find wives where there hain't none. But, Mum, I was married between daylight and dark, and But I wouldn't stay to hear another word of his apologies. I just turned my back onto him, when the door opened again and a woman came out, and I'll be hanged if her nose didn't look like mine, a honorable Roman. The man looked at her in a kind of a undecided way, but she walked right up and took holt of his arm, and he brightened up, and says he, "Are you goin' home now, Marianne?" "Yes," says she, "but my name hain't Marianne, it is Mehitabel." "Wal," says he, "I knew there was a M in it." And he walked off with her with a proud and triumphant mien. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of My Opinions and Betsey Bobbet's by Mrs. Josiah Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview with Theodore and Victory. The young black African opened the door and says he, "Josiah Allen's wife and Betsey Bobbet, Mum." He had asked us our names just before he opened it. Miss Woodhull was a standin' pretty near the door, a talkin' with 3 women as we went in, but she come forward immediately and put out her hand. I took it in mine and shook it a very little, maybe 3 or 4 times back and forth. But she must have felt by that cool, cautious shake that I differed from her in her views and had come to give her a real talkin' to. One of the women she was a talkin' to had just about as noble a lookin' face as I ever see, with short white curls a-fallin' all round it. The beholder could see by the first glance onto that face that she hadn't spent all the immortal energies of her soul in makin' clover-leaf tattin', or in cuttin' calico up into little pieces just to sew 'em together again into blazin' stars and sunflower bed quilts. It was the face of an earnest, noble woman, who had asked God what he wanted her to do, and then hadn't shirked out of doin' it. Who had gripped holt of life's plow, and hadn't looked back because the furrows turned over pretty hard and the stumps was thick. She knew by experience that there was never any green sward so hard to break up as old prejudices and customs, and no stumps so hard to get round as the ridicule and misconceptions of the world. What made her face look so calm then, when she was doing all this hard work? Because she knew she was making a clearin' right through the wilderness that in the future was goin' to blossom like a rose. She was giving her life for others, and nobody ever did this since the days of Jesus, but what somethin' of his peace is wrote down on their forewords. That is the way Elizabeth Cady Stanton looked to me, as Miss Woodhull introduced me and Betsey to her, and to the 2 other ladies with her. One of the other women I fell in love with at first sight, and I suppose I should have been just so partial to her if she had been as humbly as one of the Hottentots in my old Olney's Geography, and I'll tell you why, because she was the sister of H.W. Beecher. As a general thing, I don't believe in settin' folks up, because they happen to have smart relations. In the words of one of our sweetest and noblest writers, "Because a man is born in a stable, it don't make him a horse." Not as a general thing, it don't. But not once in 100 years does nature turn out such a man as H.W.B. It takes her longer than that to get her ingrediences and materials together to make such a pure, sweet nature, such a broad charity, and such a intellect as his'n. Why, if the question had been put to me before I was born, whether I would be born his sister or the twin sister of the Queen of England, I'd never give a second thought to Miss Victoria Albert, not but what I respect the widder Albert deeply, I think she is a real nice woman. But I had rather be his sister than to be the sister of 21 or 22 other kings. For he is a king not make by the laying on of earthly hands, he is God's own anointed, and that is a royalty that can't be upsot. So, as I remarked, I s'pose Isabella Beecher Hooker would have looked pretty good to me anyway. The other lady was smart and sensible lookin', but she was some like me, she won't never be hung for her beauty. This was Susan B. Anthony. Betsey Bobbet sat down on a chair pretty nigh the door, but I had considerable talk with Susan. The other two was awful long discussin' some question with Miss Woodhull. Susan said in the course of her remarks that she had made the cause of women's rights her husband and was going to cleave to it till she died. I told her I was deeply interested in it, but I couldn't marry myself to it because before gettin' acquainted with it, I had united myself to Josiah. We had considerable reasonable and agreeable talk, such as would be expected from two such minds as mine and hern, and then the three ladies departed, and Miss Woodhull came up to me again kinder friendly, and says she, "I am glad to meet you, Josiah Allen's wife," and then she invited me to set down. As I turned round to get a chair, I see through a door into another room where sot several other women, some up to a table, and all dreadful busy readin' papers and writin' letters. They looked so business-like and earnest at their work that I knew they could not have time to backbite their neighbors, and I was glad to see it. As I took my seat, I see a awful handsome gentleman settin' on a sofa, with long hair put back behind his ears, that I hadn't catched sight of before. It was Theodore Tilton, and Miss Woodhull introduced him to Betsey and me. He bowed to Betsey, but came forward and took my hand in his'n. I couldn't refuse to take it, but I looked up in his handsome face with a look about 2/3 admiration and 1 of sorrow. If the handsomest and best feathered out angel had fell right over the walls of heaven into our dooryard at Jonesville, I couldn't have give it a more piercin' and sort of pitiful look than I did him. I then turned and silently put my umbrell in the corner and sot down. As I did so, Miss Woodhull remarked to Mr. Tilton, "She is a strong women's writer. She is one of us." "No, Victory, I hain't one of you. I am Josiah Allen's wife." Then I sithed, and says I, "Victory, you are in the right on it, and you are in the wrong on it." And says I come clear from Jonesville to try to set you right where you are wrong. Says I, almost overcome with emotion, "You are younger than I, Victory, and I want to talk with you just as friendly as if I was your mother-in-law." Says she, "Where do you think I am in the right, and where do you think I am in the wrong?" Says I, "You are right in thinkin' what a solemn thing it is to bring up children as they ought to be. What an awful thing it is to bring the little creeters into the world without their votin' on the subject at all, and then neglect 'em and abuse 'em, and make their poor little days awful long in the world, and then expect them to honor you for it. You are right in your views of health, and women's votin', and et cetery. But you are wrong, Victory, and I don't want you to get mad at me, for I say it with as friendly feelin's as if I was your mother-in-law. You are wrong in this free love business. You are wrong in keepin' house with 2 husbands at the same time." "2 husbands? It is false. I was divorced from him, and my husband and I found him perishing in the streets, and we took him home and took care of him till he died. Which would the Lord have done, Josiah Allen's wife? Passed by on the other side, or took pity on him?" "I don't know what the Lord would have done, Victory, But I believe I should have sent him to a good horspital or tavern, and hired him took care of. I never could stand it to have another husband in the same house with me and Josiah. It would seem so kind o' curious, something in the circus way. I never could stand it, never." "There have been a good many things, Josiah Allen's wife, that you have not been required to stand. God and man united you to a good husband whom you love. But in your happiness, you shouldn't forget that some other woman has been less fortunate. In your perfect happiness and harmony—" "Oh," says I candidly, "I don't say but what Josiah and me have had our little spats, Victory. Josiah will go in his stockin' feet considerable, and—" But she interrupted of me with her eyes a-flashin'. "What would you say to livin' with a man that forgot every day of his life that he was a man, and sunk himself into a brute? Leaving his young wife of a week for the society of the abandoned? What would you say to abuse that resulted in the birth of a idiot child? Would you endure such a life? Would you live with the animal that had made himself? I married a man. I never promised God nor man that I would love, honor, and obey the wild beast he changed into. I was free from him in the sight of a pure God long enough before the law freed me." I let her have her say out, for Josiah Allen's wife is one to let every man or mouse tell their principles if they have got any. And if I was conversin' with the overseer of the bottomless pit, I don't want to speak his name right out, bein' a Methodist, I would give him a chance to get up and relate his experience. But, as she stopped with her voice kinder choked up, I laid my brown cotton glove gently onto her shoulder, and, says I, "Hush up, Victory," says I. "Women must submit to some things. They can pray, and they can try to let their sorrows lift 'em nearer to heaven, makin' angels of 'em." Here Mr. Tilton spoke up, and says he, "I don't believe in the angels exclusively. I don't see why there shouldn't be he angels as well as she ones." I was tickled, and I looked at him approvingly, and says I, "Theodore, you are the first man with one exception that I ever see that felt that way, and I respect you for it," says I. "Men as a general thing think that women have got to do up all the angel business there is done. Men seem to get the idee that they can do as they are a mind to, and the Lord will wink at 'em. And there are lots of things that the world thinks would be awful coarse in a woman, but is all right in a man. But I don't believe a man's cigar smoke smells any sweeter to the Lord than a woman's would. And I don't believe a coarse, low song sounds any sweeter and purer in the ears of angels because it is sung in a bass voice instead of a soprano. I never could see why men couldn't do somethin' in the angel line themselves, as well as to put it all on to the women, when they have got everything else under the sun to do. Not but what," says I am willin' to do my part. I never was a shirk, and Josiah Allen will tell you so. I am willin' to do my share of the angel business. And says I, in a generous way, I would do it all if I only had time. But I love to see justice and reason. Nature feathers out geese and ganders equally, or if there is any difference, the ganders' wings are the most foamin' lookin'. Men's shoulders are made just the same way that women's are. Feathers would look just as well on 'em as on a woman. They can cultivate wings with just as little trouble. What is the purest and whitest unseen feathers on a livin' angel's hidden wing, Theodore and Victory? They are purity, goodness, and patience, and men can grow these unbeknown feathers just as easy as women can if they only set out." I had spoke real eloquent, and I knew it, but I felt that I had been carried away slightly by my emotions from the mission I had come on, to try to convince Miss Woodhull where she was wrong. And so, after a minute's silence, I broke out again mildly, for I felt if I give way to anger or impatience, my mission was lost. Another thing you are in the wrong in, Victory, is to think you can be lawfully married without any minister or justice of the peace. I knew that all you needed was to have it set before you plain by some female that wished you well. You are wrong in it, Victory, and I tell you so plain, and to show you that I am your well-wisher, I thought after I had convinced you that you are in the wrong, I would make you this offer. That if you and Colonel Blood will go home with Betsey and me, Elder Wesley Minkley shall marry you right in my parlor, and it shan't cost you a cent, for I will pay him myself in dried apples. Says she, I don't want any ceremony. I want the only tie to hold me to my husband to be love, the one sacred tie. Love is a first-rate tie, says I, mildly, holding on to my temper first rate. Upwards of 15 years ago, I give one of the most remarkable proofs of it that has ever been seen in this country. And for a minute my mind wandered off onto that old reverie. Why did I love Josiah Allen? But collecting my mind together, I spoke onwards, with firm and cast-iron principle. Still, although I felt that sacred tie uniting Josiah and me in a double bow knot that couldn't be untwisted, the first time we met, still, if Elder Wesley Minkley hadn't united us at the altar, or mother's parlor, I should have felt dreadful floatin' round in my mind. It should have seemed too curious and unsteady kinder, as if Josiah and me was liable to fall all to pieces at any time, and waver off in the air like two kites that had broke loose from their strings. Says I firmly, there would be a looseness to it I couldn't stand. She said I would get accustomed to it, and that custom made many things seem holy that were unholy, and many things sinful that were pure in the sight of God. But still I murmured with a sad look, but firm as old Bunker Hill, I couldn't stand it, Victory. It would seem too much like a circus. And then again, Victory, you are in the wrong of it about divorces. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Says she, Josiah Allen's wife, if divorces were free tomorrow, would you get one from Josiah? Never, says I, and my best dress most burst open at the breast, them biases always was took up a little too snug, at the idee of partin' from Josiah. Well, what is it that would hold you so fast to each other that nothing but death could separate you? Was it the few words you said before the minister? It was love, Victory, love that wouldn't let me eat a mite or sleep a wink if I couldn't put my hand into Josiah Allen any time, day or night. Then, says she, why not give other good men and women credit for being actuated by the same sentiments? Those that God has joined together, no man can put asunder. Those who are really married, heart and soul, would never separate. It would only correct abuses and separate those that man, and not God, had joined together. Says I, Victory, is there any particular need of folks lettin' men join 'em together when God hasn't? Says I, if folks was obleeged to marry, there would be some sense in such talk. Says I, they hain't no business to marry if they don't love each other. All sin brings its punishment, and them that commit the crime against their own soul of marryin' without love ought to be punished by unhappiness in their domestic relations. What else can they expect? Says I. Marriage is like baptism. Now some folks say it is a savin' ordinance. I say nobody hain't any right to be baptized unless they are saved already. Nobody hain't any business to be put in the outward form of marriage if they hain't got the inward marriage of the Spirit. Some folks marry for a home, says she. Well, they hain't no business to, says I, warmly. I had ruther live outdoors under an umbrell all my days. Those are my sentiments exactly, Josiah Allen's wife, but you can't deny that people are liable to be deceived. If they are such poor judges the first time, what would hinder 'em from being deceived the second time, and so on ad infinitum to the 20th and 30th time? Says I, firmly. Instead of folks being tied together looser, they ought to be tied as tight again. If folks knew they couldn't marry again, how many divorces do you suppose there would be? No doubt there are individual cases when there is great wrong and great sufferin'. But we ought to look out for the greatest good to the greatest number. And do you realize, Victory, what a condition society would be in if divorces was absolutely free? The recklessnesses with which new ties would be formed, the love in women's hearts that would be broken by desertion, the children that would be homeless and uncared for. When a fickle man or woman gets their eyes onto somebody they like better than they do their own lawful partners, it is awful easy to think that man and not God has jined 'em. But let folks once get the idea into their heads that marriage is a solemn thing and lasts as long as their lives do, and they can't get away from each other, they will be 10 times as careful to live peaceable and happy with their companions. Says I, when a man realizes that he can, if he wants to, start up and marry a woman before breakfast, and get divorced before dinner, and have a new one before supper time, it has a tendency to make him unstiddy and worrisome. Says I, Victory, men are dreadful tryin' by spells. Do you suppose I have lived with one for upwards of 15 years, and hain't found it out? But suppose a mother deserts a child because he is wormy, and tears his breeches. She brought him into the world, and it is her duty to take care of him. Do you suppose a storekeeper ought to take back a pink calico dress after you have made it up and washed it because the color washes out of it? You ought to have tried it before it was cut off. I married Josiah Allen with both eyes open. I didn't wear spectacles then. I wasn't starved to it, nor thumb screwed into it, and it is my duty to make the best of him. Says she, when a woman finds that her soul is clogged and hampered, it is a duty she owes to her higher nature to find relief. Says I, when a woman has such feelin's, instead of leavin' her lawful husband and goin' round huntin' up a affinity, let her take a good thorough-wort puke. Says I, in 9½ cases out of 10, it is folks' stomachs that are clogged up instead of their souls. Says I, there is nothin' like keepin' the stomach in good order to make the moral sentiments run good. Now, our Tirzah Ann, Josiah's girl by his first wife, I kinder mistrusted that she was fallin' in love with, I almost said it right out, Shakespeare Bobbet, but I thought of Betsey and turned it, with a little feller that hadn't hardly got out of his roundabouts, she bein' at the same time in pantalettes. Well, I give her a good thorough-wort puke, and it cured her, and if his mother, says I, with a keen look onto Betsey, as I thought of my night of troubles, if his mother had served him in the same way, it would have saved some folks a good deal of sufferin'. I see that again I was wanderin' off in the subject, and I says in a deep, solemn tone, I don't believe in this divorcin'. Mr. Tilton spoke up for most the first time, and says he, I think you are wrong in your views of divorce, Josiah Allen's wife. I looked into his handsome face, and my feelin's rose up strong, I couldn't throw 'em. They broke loose, and says I, in almost tremblin' tones, It is you that are in the wrong on it, Theodore. Says I, Theodore, I have read your poetry when it seemed as if I could ride right up to heaven on it, though I weigh 210 pounds by the steelyards. There is one piece by the name of Life's Victory. I hain't much of a hand for poetry, but I read it for the first time when I was sick, and it seemed as if it carried me so near to heaven that I almost begun to feather out. And when I found out who the author was, he seemed as near to me as Thomas Jefferson, Josiah's boy by his first wife. Theodore, I have kept sight of you ever since, just as proud of you as if you was my own son-in-law, and when you went off into this free love belief, I felt bad. I took out my white 25-cent handkerchief, for a tear came within, I should say 1/2 or 3/4 of an inch from my eye winkers. I held my handkerchief in my hand, the tear come nearer and nearer. He looked agitated, when up spoke Miss Woodhull. "It is perfectly right. I believe in free divorce, free love, freedom in everything." I just jammed my handkerchief back into my pocket, for that tear just turned round and travelled back to where it come from. I thought I had used mildness long enough, and I says to her in stern tones, "Victory, can you look me straight in the spectacles and say that you think this abominable doctrine of free love is right?" "Yes, Mum, I can. I believe in perfect freedom." Says I, "That is what burglars and incendiaries say." Says I, "That is the word murderers and Mormons utter." Says I, "That is the language of pirates, Victory Woodhull." She pretty near quailed, and I proceeded on. "Victory, there hain't but one true liberty, and that is the liberty of the gospel, and it hain't gospel liberty to be surrounded by a dozen husbandses and ex-husbandses." Says I, "This marryin' and partin' every day or so hain't accordin' to Scriptur." Says she, in a scornful tone, "What is Scriptur?" If I had been her mother, I would have spanked her then and there. But I wasn't, and I just turned my back to her, and says I, "Mr. Tilton, you believe the Bible, don't you?" "Yes, Mom, I do, but the Bible justifies divorce." "Yes," says I, "for one cause and no other, and the Saviour says that whosoever marries a woman put away for any but the Bible cause commits adultery, and I don't believe in adulteration, nor Josiah don't neither. But," says I convulsively, "you know a man will part with a woman nowadays if the butter don't come quick, and she will part with him if he don't hang up the boot jack. Is that Bible, Theodore?" Says I, "Don't the Bible say that except for that one reason, man and wife are married till death parts 'em?" Says I, "Is a lawyer in a frock coat with a lot of papers sticking out of his breast pocket death?" Says I, "Tell me, Theodore, is he death?" He looked convinced, and says he, "No, Mum, he hain't." "Well, then, what business has that little snip of a livin' lawyer to go round trying to make out he is death? Tell me," says I, almost wildly. I see my emotions was almost carryin' me off, and I catched holt of my dignity and continued in deep, solemn tones, "True marriage is a sacred thing, and it is a solemn thing. It is as solemn as bein' baptized. And if you are baptized once in the way you ought to be, it is enough. But the best way you can fix it, it is a solemn thing, Victory, to give your whole life and soul into the keepin' of somebody else. To place all your hopes and all your happiness in another human bein' as a woman will. A true woman, if she loves truly, never gives half of her heart or 3/4. She gives it all. She never asks how much shall I get back in money and housin' and finery, or whether she could do better in another direction. No, true love is a river that runs onward, askin' no questions of anybody, sweepin' right on with a full heart. And where does that river empty, Theodore and Victory?" They both looked as solemn as a protracted meetin', almost, as I looked at 'em, first one, then the other, through my specs. but they didn't reply. Says I, in a deep, solemn tone, "The name of the place where that river empties is Eternity." Says I, "That river of true love, as it flows through the world, gets riley sometimes by the earthly mud on its banks. Sometimes it gets mad and precipitates itself over precipices, and sometimes it seemingly turns backward a spell. But in its heart it knows where it is bound for. It keeps on growin' broader and deeper and quieter like, and as it joins the ocean, it leaves all its mud on the banks, for God cleanses it and makes it pure as the pure waters it flows into." I felt real eloquent as I said this, and it seemed to impress 'em as I wanted it to. They both of 'em have got good faces. Though I didn't like their belief, I liked their looks. They looked sincere and honest. Again I repeated, "Marriage is a solemn thing." I heard a deep sigh behind me, and a sorrowful voice exclaimed, "It is solemn then in both ways. You say it is solemn to marry, and I know," here was another deep sigh, "I know it is solemn not to." It was Betsey. She was a thinking of the editor of the Auger, and of Ebenezer, and of all the other dear gazelles that lay cold and lifeless in her burying ground. I felt that I could not comfort her, and I was silent. Miss Woodhull is a well-bred woman, and so to kinder notice Betsey, and make talk with her, says she, "I believe you are the author of these lines. If womens had a mice's will, they would arise and get a bill?" "Yes," says Betsey, trying to put on the true modesty of genius look. Miss Woodhull said she had heard it sung to several free love conventions. "How true it is," says Betsey, glancing towards Mr. Tilton, "that deathless fame sometimes comes by reason of what you feel in your heart hain't the best part of you. Now in this poem I speak heart of man, but I didn't feel it, Miss Woodhull. I didn't feel it at the time. I wrote it just for fame and to please Professor Gusha. I love men," says she, glancing at Mr. Tilton's handsome face and hitching her chair up closer to his'n. "I almost worship 'em." Theodore begun to look uneasy, for Betsey had sat down close by the side of him, and says she, "Did you ever read the soul-stirrin' lines that Miss Woodhull refers to? I will rehearse them to you, and also 3 others of 25 verses apiece, which I have wrote since on the same subject." I see a cold sweat begin to break on his white and almost marble forehead, and with an agitated move he catched out his watch, and says he, "I have an engagement." Says Betsey, beseechingly laying her hand on his coat sleeve, "I can rehearse 'em in 26 or 27 minutes, and oh, how sweet your sympathy would be to me. Let me repeat them to you, dear man." A haggard look crept into his handsome eyes, and says he, wildly turning 'em away, "It is a case of life and death," and he hurried to the door. But Betsey started up and got ahead of him. She got between him and the door, and says she, "I will let you off about hearin' the poetry, but oh, listen to my other prayer." "I won't listen to your prayer," says he, firmly. "In the name of the female women of America who worship you so, pause and hear my prayer." He paused deeply agitated, and says he, "In their name I will hear you, but what is your request, Betsey Bobbet?" She clasped her hands in a devotional way, and with as beseechin' and almost heart-meltin' a look as a dog will give to a bone held above its head, she murmured, "A lock of your hair, dear man, that I may look at it when the world looks hollow to me. A lock of your hair to make my life path easier to me." I turned my spectacles, on which principle sot enthroned, towards 'em, and listened in awful deep interest to see how it would end. Would he yield or not? He almost trembled, but finally he spoke. "Never! Betsey Bobbet, never!" And he continued in low, agitated tones, "I have got just enough to look well now." My heart throbbed proudly to see him comin' so nobly through the hot furnace of temptation, without bein' scorched. To see him bein' lifted up in the moral steelyards and found full weight to a notch. But alas! just as small foxes will gnaw into a grapevine, just so will dangerous and almost loose principles gnaw into the noble and upright nature unbeknown to them. Again Betsey says in Harrowin tones, at the same time catchin' holt of his coat skirts wildly, "If you can't part with any more, give me one hair to make my life path smoother." Alas! that my spectacles was ever bought to witness the sad sight. For with despairin', agonized countenance, such as Lucifer, son of Mr. Mornin, might have wore as he fell down, Theodore plucked a hair out of his foretop, threw it at Betsey's feet, and rushed outdoors. Betsey, with a proud, haughty look, picked it up, kissed it a few times, and put it into her portemonnaie. But I scythed. I hadn't no heart to say anything more to Victory. I bid her farewell. But after we got out in the street, I kept a scythin'. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of My Opinions and Betsey Bobbet's by Mrs. Josiah Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Women's Rights Lecturer. As we wended our way back to Miss Astor's to dinner, Betsey said she guessed after all she would go and take dinner to her cousin Ebenezer's, for her pa hadn't give her much money. Says she, "I hate to awfully. It is revoltin' to all the fina things of my nature to take dinner there, after I have been so—" She stopped suddenly, and then went on again. "But pa didn't make much this year, and he didn't give me much money. He nor ma wouldn't have thought they could have paid my fare here on the cars, if they hadn't thought certain that Ebenezer's wife would be took from us, and I should do my duty by coming. So I guess I will go there and get dinner." Thinks I to myself, if your folks had brought you up to Emmanuel labor, if they had brought you up to any other trade only to get married, you might have money enough of your own to buy one dinner independent, without dependin' on some man to earn it for you. But I didn't say nothin', but proceeded onwards to the tavern where I put up. When I got there, I met Jonathan Beans's ex-wife, and says she, "Oh, I forgot. There is a lady here that wanted to see you when you got back." "Who is it?" says I. "It is a female lecturer on women's rights," says she. "Well," says I, "principle before victuals is my theme. Fetch her on." Says she, "Go into your room, and I'll tell her you have come, and bring her there. She is awful anxious to see you." "Well," says I, "I'm visible to the naked eye. She won't have to take a telescope." And in this calm state of mind, I went into my room and waited for her. Pretty soon she came in. Jonathan Beans's ex-wife introduced us, and then went out. I rose up and took hold of her hand, but I gave it a sort of cautious shake, for I didn't like her looks. Of all the painted and frizzled and ruffled and humped up and laced down critters I ever see, she was the cap sheaf. She had a hump on her back bigger than any camel's I ever see to a menagerie, and no 3 women ever grew the hair that critter had piled onto her head. I see she was disappointed in my looks. She looked dreadful kinder scornful down onto my plain alpaca, which was made of a sensible length. Hers hung down on the carpet. I'll bet there was more'n a bushel basket of puckers and ruffles that trailed down onto the floor behind her, besides all there was on the skirt and waist. She never said a word about my dress, but I see she looked awful scornful onto it. But she went on to talk about women's rights, and I see she was one of the wild-eyed ones that don't use no reason. I see here was another chance for me to do good, to act up to principle. And as she give another humiliatin' look onto my dress, I become fully determined in my own mind that I wouldn't shirk out from doin' my duty by her, and tell her just what I thought of her looks. She said she had just returned from a lecturin' tower out in the Western States, and that she had addressed a great many audiences, and had come pretty near gettin' a women's rights governor chosen in one of the states. She got to kinder preachin' after a while, and stood up lookin' towards the ceilin', and her hands stretched out as if she was a lecturin'. Says she, "Tyrant man shan't never rule us." Says I hain't no objection to your makin' tyrant man better, if you can. There is a chance for improvement in 'em. But while we are handlin' motes, sister, let us remember that we have got considerable to do in the line of beams. Says I, to see a lot of immortal women together, sometimes, you would think the Lord had forgot to put any brains into their heads, but had filled it all up with dress patterns and gossip and beaux and tattin'. Tyrant man has encouraged this weakness of intellect. He has for ages made woman a plaything, a doll, a menial slave. He has encouraged her weakness of comprehension because it flattered his self-love and vanity to be looked up to as a superior being. He has enjoyed her foolishness. No doubt there is some truth in what you say, sister, but them days are past. A modest, intelligent woman is respected and admired now, more than a fool. It is so in London and New York Village, and, says I with some modesty, it is so in Jonesville. Tyrant man, begun the woman again, tyrant man thinks that women are weak, slavish idiots, that we don't know enough to vote, but them tyrants will find themselves mistaken. The thought that Josiah was a man came to me then as it never had before, and as she looked down from the ceiling a minute onto my dress with that scornful mien, principle nerved me up to give her a piece of my mind. Says I, no wonder men don't think that we know enough to vote when they see the way some women rig themselves out. Why, says I, a bachelder that had always kept house in a cave, that had read about both and hadn't never seen neither, would as soon take you for a dromedary as a woman. She turned round quicker'n lightnin', and as she did so, I see her lump plainer'n ever. Says she, "Do you want to insult me?" "No," says I, "my intentions are honorable, mum." "But," says I, puttin' the question plain to her, "would you vote for a man that had his pantaloons made with trails to 'em danglin' on the ground, and the vest drawed in to the bottom tight enough to cut him in two, and his coat tails humped out with a bustle, and somebody else's hair pinned on the back of his head? Would you?" says I, solemnly fixin' my spectacles keenly onto her face. Much as I respect and honor Horace Greeley, if that pure-minded and noble man should rig himself out with a bustle and trailin' pantaloons, I wouldn't vote for him, and Josiah shouldn't neither. But she went right on without mindin' me. Man has always tried to dwarf our intellects, cramp our souls. The sore female heart pants for freedom. It is sore, and it pants. Her eyes was rolled up in her head, and she had lifted both hands in a eloquent way as she said this, and I had a fair view of her waist. It wasn't much bigger'n a pipe's tail. And I says to her in a low, friendly tone, "Seein' we are only females present, let me ask you in a almost motherly way, when your heart felt sore and pantin', Did you ever loosen your corset strings?" "Why," says I, "no wonder your heart feels sore. No wonder it pants. The only wonder is that it don't get discouraged and stop beatin' at all." She wanted to wave off the subject, I knew, for she rolled up her eyes higher than ever, and again she began, "Tyrant man—" Again I thought of Josiah, and again I interrupted her by sayin', "Men hain't the worst critters in the world. They are as generous and charitable agin as some women are, as a general thing." "Then what do you want women to vote for if you think so?" "Because I want justice done to every human bein'. Justice never hurt nobody yet, and rights given through courtesy and kindness hain't so good in the long run as rights given by law. And besides, there are exceptions to every rule. There are mean men in the world as well as good ones. Justice to women won't prevent charitable men from bein' charitable, generous men from bein' generous, and good men from bein' good, while it will restrain selfishness and tyranny. One class was never at the mercy of another in any respect, without that power bein' abused in some instances. Women havin' the right to vote hain't a-goin' to turn the world over to once, and make black white in a minute, not by no means. But I sincerely believe it will bring a greater good to the female race and to the world." Says I, in my most eloquent way, "There is a star of hope arisin' in the east for women. Let us foller on after it through the desert of the present time, not with our dresses trailin' down into the sandy ground, and our waists lookin' like pismires, and our hair frizzled out like maniacs. Let us go with our own hair on our heads, soberly, decently, and in order. Let us behave ourselves in such a sober, Christian way that we can respect ourselves, and then men will respect us." "I thought," says she, "that you was a pure women's writer. I thought you took part with us in our warfare with our foeman, man. I thought you was a firm friend to women, but I find I am mistaken." "I am a friend to women," says I, "and because I am, I don't want her to make a natural born fool of herself. And I say again, I don't wonder sometimes that men don't think that women know enough to vote when they see 'em go on. If a woman don't know enough to make a dress so she can draw a long breath in it, how is she going to take deep and broad views of public affairs? If she puts 30 yards of calico into a dress, besides the trimmin's, how is she going to preach acceptably on political economy? If her face is covered with paint, and her curls and frizzles all danglin' down into her eyes, how can she look straight and keenly into foreign nations and see our relations there? If a woman don't know enough to keep her dress out of the mud, how is she going to steer the nation through the mud puddle of politics? If a woman humps herself out and makes a camel of herself, how is she going through the eye of a needle?" I said these last words in a real solemn camp meetin' tone, but they seemed to mad her, for she started right up and went out, and I didn't care a cent if she did, I had seen enough of her. She catched her trail in the door and tore off pretty nigh a yard of it, and I didn't cry about that, not a mite. I don't like these bold, brazen-faced women that go a-rantin' round the country rigged out in that way just to make themselves notorious. Their names hadn't ought to be mentioned in the same day with true, earnest women who take their reputations in their hands and give their lives to the cause of right, goin' ahead walkin' afoot through the wilderness, cuttin' down trees and diggin' out stumps, makin' a path for the car of freedom that shall yet roll onward into liberty. As soon as she was gone, I went down to eat my dinner, for I was hungry as a bear. At the dinner table, Jonathan Beans's ex-wife asked me what I would like for dessert. I told her I hadn't turned my mind much that way, for I hadn't no idee of goin' into the desert business. I wouldn't buy one anyway, and I wouldn't take one as a gift if I had got to settle down and live on it. But from what I had heard Thomas Jefferson read about it, I thought the desert of Sarah was about as roomy and raised as much sand to the acre as any of 'em. Says she, turnin' the subject, "Will you have pie or puddin'?" I couldn't see then, and I have thought about it lots since. I don't see what started her off onto joggraphy all of a sudden. After dinner I thought I would rest a spell. My talk with that female lecturer had tired me out. Principle is dreadful tuckerin' to anybody when you make it a stiddy business. I had rather wash any time than go off on a tower of it as I was. So I went to my room and sot down real comfortable. But I hadn't sot more'n a minute and a half when Betsey Bobbet came, and nothin' to do but I must go to Stewart's store with her. I hung back at first, but then I happened to think if Alexander should hear, as of course he would, that I had been to the village and hadn't been to his shop, he would have reason to feel hurt. Alexander is a real likely man, and I didn't want to hurt his feelin's, and it hain't my way to want to slight anybody. And then I had a little tradin' I wanted to do. So, take it all together, I finally told Betsey I would go with her. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of My Opinions and Betsey Bobbet's by Mrs. Josiah Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alexander's store. I had heard it was considerable of a store, but good land! It was bigger than all the shops of Jonesville put together, and 2 or 3 10-acre lots and a few meetin' housen. But I wouldn't have acted scairt if it had been as big as all Africa. I walked in as cool as a cowcumber. We sat down pretty nigh to the door and looked round a spell. Of all the sights of folks there was a comin' in all the time, and shinin' counters all down as fur as we could see, and slick-lookin' fellers behind every one, and lots of boys runnin' round, that they called Cash, I says to Betsey, "What a large family of boys Mr. Cash's folks have got, and they must some of 'em be twins. They seem to be about of a size." I was just thinkin' in a pityin' way of their mother. Poor Mrs. Cash, and how many pantaloons she would have to put new seats into, in slidin' down hill time, when Betsey says to me, "Josiah Allen's wife, hadn't you better be purchasin' your merchandise?" Says she, "I will set here and rest till you get through, and as Dia Tuppa remarked, study human nature." She didn't have no book as I could see to study out of, but I didn't make no remarks. Betsey is a curious critter anyway. I went up to the first counter. There was a real slick-lookin' feller there, and I asked him in a cool tone if Mr. Stewart took eggs and what they was a-fetchin' now. He said, "Mr. Stewart don't take eggs." "Well," says I, "what does he give now for butter in the pail?" He said, "Mr. Stewart don't take butter." "Well," says I, in a dignified way, "it hain't no matter. I only asked to see what they was a-fetchin' here. I hain't got any with me, for I come on a tower." Then I took a little roll out of my pocket and undone 'em. It was a pair of socks and a pair of striped mittens. And I says to him in a cool, calm way, "How much is Mr. Stewart a-payin' for socks and mittens now? I know they are kinder out of season now, but there hain't no danger but what winter will come, if you only wait long enough." He said, "We don't take 'em." I felt disappointed, for I did want Alexander to have 'em, they was knit so good. I was just thinking this over when he spoke up agin, and says he, "We don't take barter of no kind." I didn't know really what he meant, but I answered him in a blind way that it was just as well if they did, as fur as I was concerned, for they hadn't raised any barter that year. It didn't seem to be a good year for it. And then I continued on, maybe Mr. Stewart would take these socks and mittens for his own use. Says I, do you know whether Alexander is well off for socks and mittens or not? The clerk said, he guessed Mr. Stewart wasn't sufferin' for 'em. Well, says I in a dignified way, you can do as you are a mind to about takin' 'em, but they are colored in a good indigo blue dye, they hain't Pusley color, and they are knit on honor, just as I knit Josiah's. Who is Josiah? Says the clerk. Says I, a sort of blindly, he is the husband of Josiah Allen's wife. I wouldn't say right out that I was Josiah Allen's wife, because I wanted them socks and mittens to stand on their own merits, or not at all. I wasn't goin' to have 'em go just because one of the first women of the day knit 'em. Neither was I goin' to hang on and tease him to take 'em. I never said another word about his buyin' 'em, only mentioned in a careless way that the heels was run. But he didn't seem to want 'em, and I just folded 'em up, and in a cool way put 'em into my pocket. I then asked to look at his calicoes, for I was pretty near decided in my own mind to get a apron, for I wasn't goin' to have him think that all my property lay in that pair of socks and mittens. He told me where to go to see the calicoes, and there was another clerk behind that counter. I didn't like his looks a bit. He was real uppish lookin', but I wasn't goin' to let him mistrust that I was put to my stumps a bit. I walked up as collected lookin' as if I owned the whole caboodle of 'em, and New York Village and Jonesville, and says I want to look at your calicoes. What prints will you look at? Says he, meanin' to put on me. Says I don't want to look at no prints, says I had rather see a free-born American citizen than all the foreign princes you can bring out. Says I, Americans make perfect fools of themselves in my mind a runnin' after a parcel of boys whose only merit is they happened to be born before their brothers and sisters was. Says I, if a baby is born in a meetin' house, it don't make out that he is born a preacher. A good, smart American boy like Thomas Jefferson looks as good to me as any of your princes. I said this in a noble, lofty tone, but after a minute's thought I went on. Though, if you have got a quantity of princes here, I had as lieve see one of Victory's boys as any of 'em. The Widder Albert is a good housekeeper and a first-rate calculator and a woman that has got a right. I set a good deal of store by the Widder Albert. I always thought I should like to get acquainted with her and visit back and forth and neighbor with her. I waited a minute, but he didn't make no move towards showing me any prints. But, says he, what kind of calico do you want to look at? I thought he came off awful sudden from princes to calico, but I didn't say nothin'. But I told him, I would like to look at a chocolate-colored groundwork with a set flower on it. Shan't I show you a Dolly Varden? Says he. I see plainly that he was a-tryin' to impose on me, talkin' about princes and Dolly Varden, and says I with dignity, if I want to make Miss Varden's acquaintance, I can, without askin' you to introduce me. But, I continued coldly, I don't care about gettin' acquainted with Miss Varden. I have heard her name talked over too much in the street. I am afraid she hain't a likely girl. I am afraid she hain't such a girl as I should want my Tirzah Ann to associate with. Ever since I have started from Jonesville, I have heard that girl talked about. There is Dolly Varden, and, oh, look at Dolly Varden. I have heard it, I bet, more'n 100 times since I sought out. And it seems to me that no modest girl would be traipsin' all over the country alone, for I never have heard a word about old Mr. and Miss Varden, or any of the Varden boys. Not that it is anything out of character to go off on a tower. I am off on a tower myself," says I, with quite a good deal of dignity. "But it don't look well for a young girl like her to be streamin' round alone. I wish I could see old Mr. and Miss Varden. I would advise the old man and woman to keep Dolly at home, if they have any regard for her good name. Though I'm afraid," I repeated, looking at him keenly over my specs, "I'm afraid it is too late for me to interfere. I am afraid she hain't a likely girl." His face was just as red as blood, but he tried to turn it off with a laugh, and he said somethin' about her bein' the style and bein' gay or somethin'. But I just stopped him pretty quick. Says I, givin' him a awful searchin' look, "I think just as much of Dolly as I do of her most intimate friends, male or female." He pretended to turn it off with a laugh, but I know a guilty conscience when I see it as quick as anybody. I hain't one to break a bruised reed more than once into, and my spectacles beamed more mildly onto him, and I says to him in a kind but firm manner, "Young man, if I was in your place, I would drop Dolly Varden's acquaintance," says I. "I advise you for your own good, just as I would Thomas Jefferson." "Who is Thomas Jefferson?" says he. Says I, in a cautious tone, "He is Josiah Allen's child by his first wife, and the own brother of Tirzah Ann." I then laid my hand on a piece of chocolate ground calico, and says I, "This suits me pretty well, but I have my doubts," says I, examinin' it closer through my specs. "I mistrust it will fade some. What is your opinion?" says I, speakin' to a elegantly dressed woman by my side, who stood there with her rich silk dress a-trailin' down on the floor. "Do you s'pose this calico will wash, mum?" I was so busy a-rubbin' the calico to see if it was firm cloth that I never looked up in her face at all. But when I asked her for the third time, and she didn't speak, I looked up in her face, and I hain't come so near faintin' since I was united to Josiah Allen. That woman's head was off. The clerk see that I was overcome by somethin', and says he, "What is the matter?" I couldn't speak, but I p'inted with my forefinger steady at that murdered woman. I guess I had p'inted at her pretty nigh half a minute, when I found breath, and says I, slowly turnin' that extended finger at him, in so burnin' indignant a way that if it had been a spear he would have hung dead on it, "That is pretty doin's in a Christian country." His face turned red as blood again, and looked all swelled up, he was so mortified. And he murmured somethin' about her bein' dumb, or a dummy, or somethin', but I interrupted him, and says I guess you would be dumb yourself if your head was cut off," says I, in awful sarcastic tones. "It would be pretty apt to make anybody dumb." Then he explained it to me, that it was a wooden figure to hang their dresses and mantillies on, and I cooled down and told him I would take 1 3/4 yards of the calico, enough for a honorable apron. Says he, "We don't sell by retail in this room." I give that clerk then a piece of my mind. I asked him how many aprons he s'posed Tirzah Ann and I stood in need of. I asked him if he supposed we was entirely destitute of aprons. And I asked him in a awful sarcastic tone if he had a idee that Josiah and Thomas Jefferson wore aprons. Says I, "Anybody would think you did." Says I, turnin' away awful dignified, "When I come agin, I will come when Alexander is in the store himself." I joined Betsey by the door, and says I, "Le's go on to once." "But," says she to me in a low mysterious voice, "Josiah Allen's wife, do you suppose they would let me have a straw-colored silk dress and take their pay in poetry?" Says I, "For the land's sake, Betsey, don't try to sell any poetry here. I am wore out. If they won't take any sacks and mittens, or good butter and eggs, I know they won't take poetry." She argued a spell with me, but I stood firm, for I wouldn't let her demean herself for nothin', and finally I got her to go on. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of My Opinions and Betsey Bobbet's by Mrs. Josiah Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Harrowin Operation. All I could do and say, Betsey would keep a-goin' into one store after another, and I just trailed round with her till it was pitch dark. Finally, after arguin', I got her headed towards her cousin's. It was as late as 8:30 when I got back to Miss Asters's. As I went by the parlor door, I heard a screechin', melancholy hollerin'. Thinks as I to myself, somebody's hurt in there, some female I should think, by the voice. I thought at first I wouldn't interfere, as there was enough to take her part, for the room seemed to be chock full. So I was goin' on up to my room, when it come to my ears again, louder and more agonizin' than ever. I couldn't stand it. As a female who was devoted to the cause of right, I felt that in the behalf of my sect I should see what could be done. I kinder squeezed my way in, up towards the sound, and pretty soon I got where I could see her. Then I knew she was crazy. She looked bad. Her dress seemed to be nice silk, but it just hung on to her shoulders, and she had strung a lot of beads and things round her neck. You know how such poor critters will rig themselves out. And she had tore at her hair so she had got it all streamin' down her neck. Her face was deathly white, only in the middle of her cheeks there was a feverish spot of fire red. Her eyes was rolled up in her head. She looked real bad. She had got to the piano in some way, and there she set to poundin' it and yellin'. Oh, how harrowin' it was to the nerves. It made my heart almost ache to see her. There was a good many nicely dressed women and men in the room, and some of 'em was leanin' over the poor girl's shoulders, a-lookin' at her hands go, and some of them women's dresses was hangin' down off their shoulders, so that I thought they must have been kinder strugglin' with the maniac, and got 'em all pulled down and torn open, and they looked most as crazy as she did. The poor girl didn't know a word she was sayin', but she kep' a-mutterin' over somethin' to herself in a unknown tongue. There wasn't no words to it. But, poor thing, she didn't sense it. Some of the time she would be a-smilin' to herself, and go on a-mutterin' kinder low, and then her worse fits seemed to come on in spasms, and she would go to poundin' the piano and yellin'. And I see by the way her hands went that she had got another infirmity too. I see she had got Mr. Vitus's dance. It was a sad sight indeed. As I see the poor thing set there with her dress most off of her, just a-hangin' on her shoulders, right there before so many men, I thought to myself, what if it was my Tirzah Ann there in that condition? But one thing I know, as long as Josiah Allen's wife lived, she wouldn't go a-wanderin' round half naked to be a laughin' stock to the community. I took it so right to myself. I kep' a-thinkin' so, what if it was our Tirzah Ann, that there wasn't hardly a dry eye in my head. And I turned to a bystander, standin' by my side, and says I to him in a voice almost choked down with emotion, "Has the poor thing been so long? Can't she get any help?" Just that minute she begun to screech and pound louder and more harrowin' than ever, and I says in still more sorrowful accents, with my spectacles bent pityingly on her, "It seems to come on by spasms, don't it?" She kinder held up in her screechin' then, and went at her mutterin' agin in that unknown tongue, and he heard me, and says he, "Beautiful, hain't it?" That maddened me. I give that man a piece of my mind. I told him plainly that it was bad enough to have such infirmities without bein' made a public circus of, and I didn't have no opinion of anybody that enjoyed such a scene and made fun of such poor critters. He looked real pert and said somethin' about my not havin' a ear for music. That maddened me again, and says I, "Young man, tell me that I hain't got any ears again if you dare," and I untied my bonnet strings and lifted up the corner of my head dress. Says I, "If it hain't a ear, what is it? And as for music, I guess I know what music is as well as anybody in this village." Says I, "You ought to hear Tirzah Ann sing just between daylight and dark, if you want to hear music." Says I, "Her organ is a good soundin' one, everybody says. It ought to be, for we turned off a good 2-year-old colt and one of our best cows for it. And when she pulls out the tremblin' stopple in front of it, and plays psalm tunes Sunday nights just before sundown, with the shadders of the morning glory vines a tremblin' all over her, as she sings Old Corinth and Hebron, I have seen Josiah look at her and listen to her till he had to pull out his red bandana handkerchief and wipe his eyes." "Who is Josiah?" says he. Says I, "It is Tirzah Ann's father." And I continued goin' on with my subject. No medderlark ever had a sweeter voice than our Tirzah Ann, and when she sings about the sweet fields that stand dressed in livin' green, she sings it in such a way that you almost feel as if you had waded through the swellin' flood and was standin' in them heavenly medders. Tell me I never heard music. Ask Whitfield Minkley whether Tirzah Ann can sing Anna Lowry or not, on weekday evenin's, and old Mr. Robin Gray. Ask Whitfield Minkley if you don't believe me. He is a minister's only son, and he hadn't ought to lie." The little conceited feller's face looked as red as a beet. He was a poor lookin' excuse anyway, a uppish, dandified lookin' chap, with his mustache turned up at the corners and twisted out like a waxed end. He pretended to laugh, but he showed signs of mortification as plain as I ever see it. And he put up his specs, and I'll be hanged if he hadn't broke one eye off'n 'em, and looked at me through it. But I wasn't daunted by him, not a bit. I didn't care how close he looked at me. Josiah Allen's wife hain't afraid to be examined through a double-barreled telescope. Just then a good-lookin' man with long sensible whiskers and mustache, hangin' the way the Lord meant 'em to, and who had come up while I was a-speakin' this last, spoke to me, and says he, "I am like you, madame. I like ballads better than I do opera music for the parlor." I didn't really know what he meant, but he looked good and sensible lookin', and so says I in a blind way, "Yes, like as not." Says he, "I am very partial to those old songs you have mentioned." Says I, "They can't be bettered." Before I could say another word, that poor crazy thing begun again to yell and pound and screech, and I says to him, "Poor thing, couldn't there be somethin' done for her? If her mind can't be restored, can't she get help for Mr. Vitus's dance?" And then he explained it to me. He said she wasn't crazy and didn't have Mr. Vitus's dance. He said she was a very fashionable young lady, and it was a opera she was singin'. "A operation?" says I, scythin'. "I should think as much. I should think it was a operation. It is a operation I don't want to see or hear agin." And says I anxiously, "Is it as hard on everybody as it is on her? Does everybody have the operation as hard as she has got it?" He kinder smiled, and turned it off by sayin', "It is the opera Fra Diavole." "Brother Devil," says the conceited little chap with the waxed end mustache. "The operation of the—" On account of my connection with the M.E. Church, says I will call it David. But they both knew what I meant. "The operation of the David. I should think as much." And I don't know as I was ever more thankful than I was when I reflected how my pious M.E. parents had taught me how to shun that place of awful torment where the David makes it his home. For a minute those feelin's of thankfulness swallered these other emotions almost down. But then, as I took another thought, it maddened me to think that likely folks should be tormented by it on earth. And I says to the little feller with the waxed end mustache, "If that operation is one of the torments that the David keeps to torment the wicked with, it is a burnin' shame that it should be used beforehand, here on earth, to torment other Christian folks with." I didn't wait for him to answer, but I turned round with a real lot of dignity, and sailed out of the room. It was with a contented and happy feelin' the next mornin' that I collected together my cap box and spectacle case, packed my satchel bag with my barreled muslin nightcap and nightgown, and put my umbrella into its gingham sheath, for it was a pleasant mornin', and set, as you may say, my face homewards. I thought I would proceed right from Horace's to the depot, and not come back again to Miss Astor's. I paid my bill with a calm demeanor, though it galled me to see 'em ask such a price. Jonathan Beans's ex-wife seemed to hate to have me go. She is one that don't forget the days when she first went to grass. I told her to tell Miss Astor just how it was, that I felt as if I must go, for Josiah would be expectin' me. But I would love to stay and get acquainted with her. But she had so much on her hands, such a gang to cook for, that I know she didn't have no time to visit with nobody. And I told her to be sure and tell Miss Astor that she mustn't feel particular at all because we hadn't visited together. But she must pay me a visit just the same. Then I sent my best respects to Mr. Astor and the boys, and then I set out. Just by the front door I met Betsey, and we both set sail for Horace's. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of My Opinions and Betsey Bobbet's by Mrs. Josiah Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A visit to Horace. It was with a beaten heart that I stood at the door of the shop where Horace's papers are made. And though he hain't printed 'em alone since he was run up, as he did more formally, they told me I would be apt to find him at his old office. I was just a-goin' to knock when a boy came out, and says I, "Bub, I want to see Horace." "Horace who?" says he. "Horace Greeley," says I. "Well," says he, "I will take up your card." I see then that he was tryin' to impose on me. I hain't naturally warlike, but I can stand up on my dignity straight as a cob when I set out. Says I, "I'll have you know that I am a member of the Methodist Meetin' House," says I, warmly. "I don't know one card from another, and I'm glad I don't." Says I presume there are women here in the village, as old as I be, that set up to play cards till 9 or 10 o'clock at night, but thank Fortin I hain't one of 'em. Says I, "Young man, I detest card playin'. It ends in gamblin'. Now," says I, firmly, "you just tell me where Horace is, or I'll know the reason why." He see I wasn't to be trifled with any more. He muttered somethin' about his not bearin' the blame. But he went upstairs, and we follered tight to his heels, and the minute he opened the door we went in. Horace hadn't dressed up much, for I s'pose he didn't expect us. But if he had been dressed up in pink silk throughout, it wouldn't have made no difference to my feelin's as I catched sight of that noble and benign face, that peaceful innocent mouth, that high forward, with the hair a curlin' round the sides of it like thin white clouds curlin' round the side of a mountain in Injun summer. I use that figure of speech because his face looked on the mountain plain, firm and grand and decided. And I put the Injun summer because you know just how a mountain will look standin' a considerable ways above you on the 1st of October, kind o' mellow and peaceful and benign. But you realize all the time that under all the green and shady growth of its mosses and evergreens, it has been growin' gradual but stiddy through the centuries. Under all that veil of shinin' blue gauze, wove out of mist one way, with a warp of sunshine under all the mellow colorin' the time of the year has give it, there is a good strong backbone of solid rock in the old mountain that couldn't be broke by all the hammers in creation. That was just my idee of his face, a mountain in Injun summer facin' the sunrise, standin' up so high that it catches a light on its forehead before the world below gets lit up. Firm, solid principles with the edge took off of 'em, and kinder topped off with the experiences and gradual convictions and discoveries of a noble life. And all softened down by the calmness and quiet of the time of day and the fall of the year. That was the way Horace Greeley's face looked to me as I got a full view of it as he set to his desk a-writin'. In the dead of night, on my own peaceful goose-feather bed at home, I had made a speech all up in my mind for that glorious occasion when two firm and true principled minds should meet, which was Horace's mind and mine. For though we conflict in some things, the good of the human race is as dear as our apples is in our eyes. But at the first sight of that noble face, my emotions got up and overpowered me so that I forgot every word of my speech, and all I could say was, in thick tones of feelin' and principle, "Horace, I have come." His face grew almost black with fear and anger. He sprang up and waved me back with his right hand and shouted to me, "It is in vain, madame. You are the 94th woman who has been here today after office. Female lobsteress, depart. Get thee behind me, female." Says I, with deep emotion, "Horace, you don't know me. I am not a female lobsteress. I am Josiah Allen's wife." He came forward and shook hands with me, and, says he, "I know you will excuse my vehemence when I tell you I am almost devoured by office seekers." He cleared a path through the papers on the floor to some chairs, but as we sat down, he continued in tremblin' tones, for it seemed as if he couldn't forget his troubles, "Foxes and woodchucks have holes, but a candidate for the presidency can't find none small enough to hide in. I did," says he, sithin' deeply, "I did have a few peaceful, happy hours in the sullar of my dwellin' house." He paused, overcome by sad recollections, and, says I, deeply sympathizin' and interested, "What broke it up, Horace?" "They found the outdoor sullar way. So," says he, sithin' again, "I lost that peaceful haven." "Well," says I, trying to soothe his agitation, "you're one in a high, noble place, Horace." "Yes," says he, "but it places anybody under a very strong light, a very strong light. I have never done anything out of the way since I was first born, but what I have seen it in the papers. I tore my pantaloons once," says he, gloomily, in gettin' over the fence at the early age of 2 1/2, and I bit my mother once at the age of 7 months a nursin', I could wish these 2 errors of my past to be forgotten by the world and overlooked, but in vain. I am taunted with 'em on every side. I never threw a boot-jack at a tomcat in the dead of the night, but what my picture has been took in the act. I never swore a oath to myself in the depths of my own stomach, but what I have seen that unspoken oath in the papers. I never jawed Mrs. Greeley about my shirt buttons," he continued sadly, "in the depths of our secluded chamber, but what it has been illustrated with notes." As he spoke of John about shirt buttons, I says to myself, how much human nature is alike in all men. And I says aloud, how much you remind me of Josiah. "Of Josiah?" says he, and that name seemed to make him remember himself, and to come nobly out of his gloomy reflections. "Josiah, he is your husband. Oh yes, Josiah Allen's wife. I am glad to meet you, for although I couldn't comply with the request your letter contained, yet it convinced me that you are a sincere friend to the human race." "Yes," says I, "Horace, I am, and I want you to consider my request over again." But he interrupted me hurriedly, seemin' to want to turn my mind from that subject. "What do you think of Fourier's system, Josiah Allen's wife?" says he, looking at me languidly over his specs. Says I never see Mr. Fourier. How can I tell you anything about the old man's health, whether his system is all right, or whether he is enjoyin' poor health? Horace, I come to talk with you on more important things." But he continued placidly, hoping to draw my mind off, "What do you think of Darwin's idees?" "Darwin who?" says I. "Darwin Goudy? I don't know any other Darwin, and I never mistrusted that he had any idees. He is most a natural fool." Says he, "About our descendin' from a monkey?" Says I, with dignity, "I don't know how it is with you, but I know that I couldn't descend from a monkey, never bein' on one's back in my whole life." Says I never looked well in the saddle anyway, bein' so hefty. But, says I, in a liberal way, if you or anybody else wants to ride monkeys, you have the privilege, but I never had no leanin' that way. And again, says I, in agitated tones, you needn't try to take my mind off'n the deep and momentous subject on which it is sought by talkin' 'bout ridin' monkeys. Horace, I have come clear down here to the village on purpose to ask you to examine your platform and see if there hain't no loose boards in it where some of the citizens of the United States, such as Wimmen, can fall through. Platforms that are built over the deep waters ought to be sound, and every board ought to be nailed down tight, so that nobody, not even the smallest and weakest, can fall through and get drownded. Says I, your doorstep is most all good solid timber, but I feel there is one old, moldy, worm-eaten board that is loose in it. And with emotion renderin' my voice weak as a cat, says I, Horace, I want you to examine your doorstep and lay down a new board, and I will help you do it. I come a purpose to." He see it was vain to turn the current of my thoughts round, and says he in a decided way, "You must have become aware of my views from the contents of my letter. You got my letter?" says he in a inquirin' tone. "Yes," says I have framed it and got a glass over it just because it was your writin', but there seemed to be a mistake in it. It seemed to be wrote to Josiah." Says he, "What did you make it out to be?" Says I, "It seemed to run as follers. I don't want to purchase any more shoats." Josiah did have an uncommon kind of pigs, and we thought maybe you had heard that Josiah wanted to sell you one, though it was a mistake, for he swapped a couple with Deacon Gowdy for a yearlin heifer, and he didn't have no more left than he wanted to keep over. He said we didn't read it right. It read, I don't approve of any women's votes. And says he, leanin' back in his chair, that is the ground I take. I don't believe in women's rights. I don't see what rights they want more'n they have now. Then I dove right into the subject that was the nearest to my heart, with the exception of Josiah, and says I, Horace, we want the right of equal pay for equal labor, the right of not being taxed without representation, the right of not being compelled, if she is a rich woman, of letting her property go to support public men who are making laws that are ruinin' them she loves best, such as giving licenses to ruin body and souls, the right to stand by the side of all good and true souls in the nation, and trying to stop this evil spirit of intemperance and licentiousness that is runnin' rampant through the land, the right to... I don't know how much longer I should have gone on, but in the noble forgetfulness of yourself that always accompanies genius, I had riz up, and by an unguarded wave of my right hand, a wavin' in eloquence, I tipped over my umbrell. Horace picked it up, he is a perfect gentleman at heart, and says he, Set down, Josiah Allen's wife, don't fatigue yourself too much. Rememberin' myself, I sot down, and Horace, pensively wipin' his brow with his lead pencil, went on to say, I admit there is some truth in what you say, Josiah Allen's wife. I admit, as a truthful man should, that whatever women has laid their hands to, such as churches, hospital work, foreign missionary work, ragged schools, Sunday schools, charity balls and fairs, and good Templars, they have done more than men in their efforts and good influence. They are more patient than men. They are not so strong, but they are more persistent. When they once get a plan in their heads, they are awful to hold on. If they can't accomplish it in one way, they will take another. Says I, that is just what Josiah says. He says, I always have my own way. I admit that whenever women have been admitted in any public affairs, they have had a purifyin' and softenin' and ennoblin' influence. But I deny that votin' and havin' a voice in public affairs is goin' to better the condition of either women or the nation. Says I, Horace, the old white house needs purifyin' more than any horse-spittle or meetin' house in creation. And says I, let women lay to and help clean house. Says I, let her try her hand for 1 year and see what she can do. Says Horace, going on placidly with his own thoughts, it is not the change that would be wrought in public affairs I dread, so much as the change in the women themselves, if they should mingle in the wild vortex of political life. I have 2 daughters, and rather than have them lose all their delicacy, and enter political life and mount the rostrum, I would lay them in their grave. I don't believe, says he with great decision, I don't believe in women leading off into politics and mountin' the rostrum. I interrupted him with a earnest tone. You needn't twit me of that no more, Horace. I don't want to mount no rostrum. I had rather give Josiah 20 curtain lectures than to give half of one to the public. There would be more solid satisfaction in it. But as far as indelicacy is concerned, it is no more immodest for a woman to lead off in politics than to lead off one of your indecent German waltzes with a man. Says I, you men think it hain't indelicate for women to go with you to balls and to theatres and into the wild vortex of the ocean a bathin' with you, and to post offices, and to fires, and fairs, and horse races, and to church, and to heaven with you. But it is awful to go and drop a little slip of white paper into a box once a year with you. Says Horace, waving off that idee, "Woman holds in her arms a more powerful ballot than she can in her hands. Let her mold her baby boy so that in the future his mother will vote through him." Horace looked noble as he said this. His silver-mounted spectacles shone with pure feelin' and principle. "But," says I in a reasonable tone, "how can women mold children if she hain't got any to mold? I hain't got any of my own, and lots of women hain't." Says I, "Such talk is unreasonable. How can she go to moldin' when she hain't got the materials?" "Let them influence their husbands then," says he. "The influence of women over men is wonderful, and they can in this very way wield a almost sovereign power. And they do in many instances exert this indirect power in an eminent degree." Says I, finally, "I don't believe in no underhand proceedin'. I never did. The idee of women bein' underhand and go to moldin' men on the sly, I don't believe in it." Says I, "Accordin' to your own story, Horace, women have a influence in politics now." "Wal, yes, a sort of indirect influence in their families, as it were." Says I, "Horace, can you look me straight in the spectacles and deny that there is women's influence in politics at Washington today?" Says I, "Look at them female lobsteresses there." Says I, "One handsome, brilliant, unprincipled bad woman will influence 14 common men, where a modest, humbly well-wisher of her sect will 1. And says I, warmly, for the thought of these female lobsteresses always madded me, "I should be ashamed if I was in some of them senators' places, makin' laws about the Mormons." I see my deep principle was a-floatin' me off into a subject where as a female I didn't want to go, and so I choked back the words I was about to utter, which was, "I had just as lives jine a Mormon as to jine one of them." I choked it back and struggled for calmness, for I was excited. But I did say this: "I think good women ought to have a chance with bad ones in political affairs, for there is more good women in the land than there is bad ones, but now the bad ones have it all their own way." Horace wiped his brow gently with his lead pencil, and said in a thoughtful accent, "There may be some truth in what you say, Josiah Allen's wife. I confess I never looked at it in exactly this light before." Says I, in a triumphant glad tone, "That is just what I told Josiah. Says I, Josiah, Horace is all right. There never was a better meanin' man in the face of the earth than Horace is. All he wants is to have some noble principled woman to set him right in this one thing." I see in a minute that I had made a mistake. Men hate to be dictated to by a woman. They hate to like a dog. I see by his lowery brow that I had put the wrong foot forward. For the time bein', the sage and the philosopher sunk down in his nature, and the man spoke in the usual man-like way. "I say women's brains are too weak to grasp public matters. They have remarkable intuitions, I grant. A woman's insight or instinct, or whatever you may term it, will, I grant, fly over a mountain and discover what is on the other side of it, while a man is getting his gunpowder ready to make a tunnel through it. But they are not logical. They have not the firm grasp of mind, the clear comprehension requisite to a voter." Says I, "Horace, which has the firmest grasp, the clearest comprehension? A earnest, intelligent Christian woman or a drunken Irishman? Says I, understand me, Horace, I don't ask which would sell their votes at the best lay, or vote the most times in one day. I dare say the man would get ahead of the woman in these respects, bein' naturally more of a speculator, and also bein' in practice. You know practice makes perfect. I don't ask you this, but I ask you and I want you to answer me, Horace, which would be in the best condition for votin'? Elizabeth Cady Stanton gettin' up off her religious knees in the mornin' after family prayers, and walkin', with the Constitution in one hand and the Bible in the other, coolly and sensibly to the poll, or Patrick O'Flannigan comin' out of a drunken wake, and staggerin' up against the poll with a whiskey bottle in one hand and a club in the other, when he didn't know nothin' in the first place, and then had lost half or 3/4 of that in the liquor some clear-minded, logical man give him for votin' a few dozen times for him?" At this question Horace quailed a very little. But it was not the quail of a weak man. There was principle in that quail, and a determination to argue to the end, which is one of the characteristics of that great and good man. She that was Samantha Smith also possesses some of this spirit. "Set down, Josiah Allen's wife, and don't fatigue yourself too much," says Horace, for almost carried away by my emotions, I had riz up and stood on my feet again. And he went on, "You put the case in a very strong light, Josiah Allen's wife. That is one of the peculiar weaknesses of your sect. You don't possess sufficient moderation. You exaggerate too much." Says I, "Publishin' a daily paper for 20 years has a tendency to make any man a good judge of exaggeration, and if you see by my symptoms that I have got it, I hain't a goin' to deny it. But you ain't answered my question yet, Horace." Says he, "Josiah Allen's wife, my mind is firmly made up on this subject, and nothin' upon earth will ever change it. I am fully convinced that women's enterin' into public duties would result in makin' her coarse and unfeminine, and makin' her lose her love for home and husband. And then, suppose she were eligible for public offices. Imagine a lady blacksmith, a lady constable, a lady president. It is absurd, Josiah Allen's wife." Says I, "Horace, you are too smart a man to bring up such poor arguments. You don't see a little sickly, literary, consumptive, broken-backed blacksmith or constable. Men choose the occupations most congenial and suitable for them, and women would do the same anyway. Rosa Bonheur chooses to live outdoors half the time among cattle and horses, and I presume she ain't half so afraid of 'em as Mr. A. Tennyson would be. I have heard Thomas Jefferson read about 'em both. I don't suppose any woman would be compelled to be made a constable of, though if they was, I presume men would submit to be incarcerated by 'em as quick as they would by a male man. As for the idea of a lady president, I don't know as it would be any more absurd than a lady queen. Victory sets up pretty easy in her high chair. There don't seem to be anything very absurd about the Widder Albert. You say public duties makes a woman coarse and forgetful of home and husband. Horace, look for 1 minute at the Widder Albert. Where will you find among your weak, fashionable women so lovin' a wife, so devoted a mother? Where will you find a bigger house full of children, brought up better than hern? She has had more public duties to perform than goin' once a year by the side of her husband and votin' for justice and temperance. But did these public duties, that she performed so well, wean her from her husband? Says I, did they take up her mind so that she didn't almost break her heart when he died? Says I, do you think a honest desire to live a full life, to use every power that God has given you, to do your very best for God and humanity? Do you think this desire, modestly and consistently carried into action, will make a woman coarse and unwomanly any more than this present fashionable education to flirt and simper and catch a rich husband? Says I, you seem to think that votin' is going to be such a weight onto a woman that it will drag her right down from her home into public and political affairs and leave her there. Such talk is simple, for love and domestic happiness will be the other weight to the steelyards as long as the world stands, and keep a woman's heart and mind just as straight as a string. Votin' hain't a-goin' to spile any woman at all, be she married or be she single, and there is a class at the mercy of the world fightin' its hard battle alone, it will help them. The idee of its hurtin' a woman to know a little somethin' is in my mind awful simple. That was just what the slaveholders said about the black Africans. It would hurt 'em to know too much. That is what Mr. Pope says today about his church members. But I say that any belief or custom that relies on oppression and ignorance and weakness to help it on in any degree ought to be exploded up. Beautiful weakness and simplicity hain't my style at all in the line of women. I have seen beautiful simplicities before now, and they are always affected, selfish critters, sly, underhanded, their minds all took up with some little petty gossip and plottins. Why, they can't set a teacup on the table in a open-hearted, noble way. They have to plot on some byway to get it there, unbeknown to somebody. Their mouths have been drawed so into simpers that they couldn't laugh a open, generous laugh to save their lives. Always havin' some spear ready under their soft mantilly to sweetly spear some other woman in the back. Horace, they hain't my style. Beautiful weakness and simplicity may do for one evenin' in a ballroom, but it don't wear well for all the cares and emergencies that come in a life of from 40 to 50 years. Was George Washington's mother any the less a industrious, economical, and affectionate wife and mother, because she took a interest in public affairs? And says I, with a lower and more modest tone, is Josiah Allen's wife on that account any the less devoted to Josiah? He knew I was perfectly devoted to that man. He set musin' silently for a time, seemin'ly on somethin' I had said heretofore, and finally he spoke up. The case of Victory is very different. A crown that descends on a hereditary head is a different thing. So 'tis, says I, but the difference is on the wrong side. For s'posen it descends onto the head of a hereditary fool, or a hereditary mean woman. If a woman was voted for, it would be for goodness, or some other good quality. Says Horace, wavin' off that idee and pursuin' after his own thoughts. Man is sometimes mistaken in his honest beliefs, but nature makes her laws unerringly. Nature intended the male of every species to take the preeminence. Nature designed man to be at the head of all public affairs. Nature never makes any mistakes. Nature made queen bees, Horace. Old Nature herself clapped the crown onto 'em. You never heard of king bees, did you? Industrious, economical critters the bees are too. The public duties of that female don't spile her, for where will you find housework done up slicker than hern? Where will you find more stiddy, industrious, economical, orderly doin's through a whole nation than she has in hern? All her constituents up to work early in the mornin', home at night too, just as stiddy as the night comes. No foreign spies can come prowlin' around her premises. Speculators on other folks' honey hain't encouraged. Tobacco is obnoxious to 'em. Only one thing I don't approve of. If food is scarce, if the females don't get honey enough to last the whole hive all winter, they slaughter the male bees in the fall to save honey. I don't approve of it. But where will you find a great natur that hain't got its peculiar eccentricities? This is hern. She wants to dispose of the drones, as they call the lazy husbands of the workin' women, and she thinks killin' is the easiest way to dispose of 'em. I say plainly I don't approve of it. It don't seem exactly right to kill a husband to save winterin' him. It would seem better to me to get divorces from 'em and set 'em up in business in a small way. But, as I said, where is there a natur that hain't got a weakness? This is hern. But aside from this, where will you find a better calculator than she is? No dashin' female lobsteresses pullin' the wool over the eyes of her senators. No old men bees gaddin' round evenin's when their confidin' wives think they are abed dreamin' about their lawful pardners. No wild cattishness and smokin' and drunkenness and quarrelin' in her Congress. You can't impeach her administration nohow, for no clockwork ever runs smoother and honester. In my opinion, there has a great many men set up in their high chairs that would have done well to pattern after this executive female." As I finished, flushed with several different emotions, Horace rose up and grasped me by the hand, and says almost warmly, "I am glad to have met you, Josiah Allen's wife. You have presented the subject in a new and eloquent light. I admire eloquence wherever I meet it." The praise of this great and good man was like manna to an Israelitis. My breast almost swelled with proud and triumphant emotions. But even then, in that blissful moment, I thought of Josiah. No rock was ever firmer than my allegiance to that man. I withdrawed my hand gently from his'n, and I said to him with a beam in face, "You grasped hold of my hand, Horace, with the noblest and purest of feelin's, but I don't think Josiah would like to have me shake hands so often with any man." Says he, "I honor your sentiments, Josiah Allen's wife. I think you are a firm, principled woman, and a earnest, well-wisher of your sect. But I do think you are in a error. I honestly think so. The Creator designed woman for a quiet, home life. It is there she finds her greatest happiness and content. God gave her just those faculties that fit her for that life. God never designed her to go rantin' round in public, preachin' and lecturin'." Says I, "Horace, I agree with you in thinkin' that home is the best place for most women. But you say that women have great influence and great powers of persuasion, and why not use them powers to win men's souls and to influence men in the cause of temperance and justice, as well as to use 'em all up in teasin' their husbands to buy 'em a summer bonnet and a pair of earrings? And take such women as Anna Dickinson. What under the sun did the Lord give her such powers of eloquence and persuasion for, if he didn't calculate to have her use 'em? Why, you would say a human bein' was a fool that would go to work and make a melodious piano, a calculatin' to have it stand dumb forever, holdin' back all the music in it, not lettin' any of it come out to chirk folks up and make 'em better. When a man makes a cheese press, he don't expect to get music out of it. It hain't reasonable to expect a cheese press to play Yankee Doodle and Old Hundred. I myself wasn't calculated for a preacher. I believe the Lord knows just what he wants of his creeters here below, from the biggest to the littlest. When he makes a grasshopper, he makes it loose jointed on purpose to jump. Would that grasshopper be a fulfillin' his mission and doin' God's will, if he should draw his long legs up under him and crawl into a snail's house and make a lame hermit of himself?" Says Horace, in reasonable accents, No, Josiah Allen's wife. No, he wouldn't. Well, says I, likewise with birds. If the Lord hadn't wanted the sing to come out of their throats, he wouldn't have put it into 'em. And when the Lord has put eloquence and inspiration and enthusiasm into a human soul, you can't help it from breaking out. I say it is right for a woman to talk if she has got anything to say for God and humanity. I have heard men and women both talk when they hadn't nothing to say, and it is just as tiresome in a man as it is in a woman, in my opinion. Now, I never had a call to preach, or if I had, I didn't hear it. Only to Josiah, I preach to him considerable. I have to. I should feel dreadful curious a-standin' up in the desk and takin' my text. I don't deny it. But, says I, in deep tones, if the Lord calls a woman to preach, let her preach, Horace. Paul says it is a shame for a woman to speak in public, says Horace. Oh, what a rush of idees flowed under my foretop as Horace said this. But I spoke pretty calm, and says I hain't nothin' against Mr. Paul. I think he is a real likely old bachelder. But I put the words and example of Jesus before them of any man, be he married or be he single. Men will quote Mr. Paul's remarks concernin' women not preachin', and say he was inspired when he said that. And I say to 'em, how is it about folks not marryin'? He speaks full as p'inted about that. Oh, they say, he wasn't inspired when he said that. And I say to 'em, how can you tell? When a man is 18 or 1900 years older than you be, how can you tell when he was inspired and when he wasn't, not bein' a neighbor of his'n? And after all, Mr. Paul didn't seem to be so awful set on this subject, for he went right on to tell how a woman's head ought to be fixed when she was a-prayin' and a-prophesying. But, in my opinion, all that talk about women was meant for that church he was a-writin' to, for some reason confined to that time, and don't apply to this day, or this village, and so with marryin'. When a man was liable to have his head cut off any minute, or to be eat up by lions, it wasn't convenient to marry and have a widder and a few orphans. That is my opinion, other folks have theirn. But let folks quarrel all they have a mind to as to whether Mr. Paul was inspired when he wrote these things, or whether he wasn't. This we know, that Jesus is a divine pattern for us to follow, and he chose a woman to carry the glad tidings of his resurrection to the brethren. There was one woman who received her commission to preach right from the Almighty. How dare any man to try to tie up a woman's tongue and keep her from speaking of him, when she was his most tender and faithful friend when he was on earth? It was women who brought little children that he might bless 'em. Did he rebuke 'em for thus daring to speak to him publicly? No, but he rebuked the men who tried to stop 'em. It was a women who anointed his feet, wet 'em with their tears, and wiped 'em with the hairs of her head. It was very precious ointment, but none too precious for him she loved so. Some logical, clear-minded men present thought it was too costly to waste on him. And again Jesus rebuked 'em for troubling the woman. It was in comforting a woman's lovin' achin' heart that Jesus wept. It was women that stood by the cross to the very last, and who stood by his grave weepin', when even Joseph had rolled a great stone against it and departed. And it was women who came to the grave again in the mornin' while it was yet dark. And it was a woman that he first revealed himself to after he rose. What if Mary had hung back and refused to tell of him and the glory she had seen? Would he have been pleased? No. When God calls a woman to tell of the wonders of his love and glory that he has revealed to her out of the darkness of this life, In the Lord's name, let her answer. But let her be certain that it is the Lord that is calling her. There is lots of preachers of both sects, in my opinion, that pretend the Lord is a callin' 'em, when it is nothin' but their own vanity and selfishness that is hollerin' to 'em." For pretty near half or 3/4 of a minute, Horace sat almost lost in deep thought, and when he broke out again it was on the old theme. He said, "Wedlock was woman's true spear. In the noble position of wife and mother, there lay her greatest happiness and her only true spear." He talked pretty near 9 minutes, I should think, on this theme, and he talked eloquent and grand, I will admit, and never did I see spectacles shine with such pure fervor and sincerity as his'n. It impressed me deeply. Says he, in conclusion, "Marriage is God's own institution. To be the wife of a good man and the mother of his children ought to be a woman's highest aim and purest happiness, just as it is a man's highest happiness to have a woman entirely dependent on him. It rouses his noblest and most generous impulses. It moves his heart to do and dare, and his arm to labor, to have a gentle being clingin' to his manly strength." His eloquence so impressed me that I had no words to reply to him, and for the first time since I had begun to foller up the subject, my mind wavered back and forth, as Bunker Hill Monument might in a eloquent earthquake. I says to myself, maybe I am mistaken, maybe marriage is woman's only true spear. I didn't know what to say to him. My spectacles wandered about the room, and happened to light on to Betsey. I had been so took up with my mission to Horace that I had forgot to introduce her. And as they lit, Horace, who saw I was deeply impressed, repeated something about clingin', and I says to him in a foolish and almost mechanical tone, "Yes, Horace, I have seen clingers. Here is one." Betsey riz right up and come for'ard, and made a low curtsy to him, and set down tight to him, and says she, "Beloved and admired Mr. Horace Greeley, I am Betsey Bobbet, the poetess of Jonesville, and you speak my sentiments exactly. I think, and I know, that wedlock is women's only true spear. I do not think women ought to have any rights at all. I do not think she ought to want any. I think it is real sweet and genteel in her not to have any rights. I think that to be the clinging, devoted wife of a noble husband would be almost a heaven below. I do not think she ought to have any other trade at all, only wedlock. I think she ought to be perfectly dependent on men and just cling to them, and oh, how sweet it would be to be in that state. How happifying to males and to females that would be. I do not believe in women having their way in anything, or to set up any beliefs of their own. For oh, how beautiful and perfectly sweet a noble manly mind is. How I do love your intellect, dearest Mr. Horace Greeley. How is your wife's health, dear man? Hain't I read in the papers that her health was a failing? And if she should drop off, should you think of entering again into wedlock? And if you did, should you not prefer a woman of genius, a poetess, to a woman of clay?" Her breath give out here, and she paused. But oh, what a change had come over Horace's noble and benign face as Betsey spoke. As she begun, his head was thrown back, and a eloquent philosophical expression set onto it. But gradually it had changed to a expression of dread and almost anger, and as she finished, his head sunk down into his breast, and he sighed. I pitied him, and I spoke up to Betsey. Says I hain't no more nor less than a clay woman, but I know enough to know that no man can answer 25 or 26 questions to once. Give Horace time to find and recover himself." Betsey took a bottle of hartshorn and a pair of scissors out in her pocket, and advanced unto him, and says she in tender, cooin' tones, "Does your intellectual head ache? Let me bathe that lofty for'ard. And oh, dearest man, will you hear my one request that I have dreamt of day and night? Will you give me a lock of your noble hair?" Horace rose up from his chair precipitately and come close to me and sot down, bringin' me between him and Betsey, and then he says to her in a fearless tone, "You can't have a hair of my head. I hain't got much, as you can see, but what little I have got belongs to my wife and to America. My wife's health is better, and in case of her droppin' off, I shouldn't ever marry agin, and it wouldn't be a poetess. Though," says he, wipin' his heated for'ard, "I respect 'em as a race." Betsey was mad. Says she to me, "I am a-goin'. I will wait for you at the depot." And before I could say a word, she started off. As the door closed, I says in clear tones, "Horace, I have watched you for years, a laborin' for truth and justice and liftin' up the oppressed. I have realized what you have done for the black African. You have done more for that race than any other man in America. And I have respected you for it, as much as if I was a black African myself. But never did I respect you as I do this minute," says I. "If every married man and woman had your firm and almost cast iron principles, there wouldn't be such a call for powder and bullets among married folks as there is now. You have risen my estimation 25 cents within the last 7 or 8 minutes." Horace was still almost lost in thought, and he didn't reply to me. He was a-settin' about 1/2 or 3/4 of a yard from me, and I says to him mildly, "Horace, it may be as well for you to go back now to your former place of settin', which was about 2½ yards from me." He complied with my request, mechanically as it was, but he seemed still to be almost lost in thought. Finally he spoke, as he wiped the sweat off that had started out onto his eyebrow, these words: "I am not afraid nor ashamed to change my mind, Josiah Allen's wife, when I am honestly convinced I have been in an error." Says he, "It is cowards only that cling outwardly to their old mouldy beliefs, for fear they shall be accused of being inconsistent and fickle-minded." Says I, "That is just my opinion, Horace. I have been cheated by pickin' out a calico dress in the evenin'. Things look different by daylight, from what they do by candlelight. Old beliefs that have looked first rate to you may look different under the brighter light of new discoveries. As you rise higher above the earth, you see stars you couldn't catch sight of in a suller way. And the world's cry of fickle-mindedness may be the angel's war-whoop settin' us on to heavenly warfare." Horace seemed again to be almost lost in thought, and I waited respectfully for him to find and recover himself. Finally he spake. "I have been sincere, Josiah Allen's wife, in thinkin' that matrimony was woman's only spear, but the occurrences of the past 25 or 30 minutes has convinced me that women may be too zealous a carryin' out that spear. I admit, Josiah Allen's wife, that any new state of public affairs that would make woman more independent of matrimony, less zealous, less reckless in handlin' that spear, might be more or less beneficial both to herself and to man." Here he paused and sighed. He thought of Betsey. But I spoke right up in glad and triumphant tones. "Horace, I am ready to depart this minute for Jonesville. Now I can lay my head in peace upon my goose feather pillow." I riz up in deep emotion, and Horace he riz up too. It was a thrillin' moment. At last he spoke in agitated tones, for he thought still of what he had just passed through. "My benefactor, I tremble to think what might have happened had you not been present." And he ran his forefinger through his almost snowy hair. "My kind preserver, I want to give you some little token of my friendship at parting. Will you accept as a slight token of my deathless gratitude what I know about farming and 2 papers of lettuce seed?" I hung back, I thought of Josiah. But Horace argued with me. Says he, "I respect your constancy to Josiah, but intellect, spoken or written, scorns all the barriers of sex and circumstance, and is free to all, as the sunshine that beats down on the just and the unjust, the liberal Republicans and the Grant party, or the married and the single." Says he, "Take the book without any scruples, and as for the lettuce seed, I can recommend it. I think Josiah would relish it." Says I, "On them grounds I will accept of it, and thank you." As we parted at the door, in the innocence of conscious rectitude, we shook hands, and says I, "Henceforth, Horace, you will set up in a high chair in my mind, higher than ever before. Of course, Josiah sets first in my heart, and then his children, and then a few relations on my side and on his'n. But next to them you will always set, for you have been weighed in the steelyards and have been found not wanton." He was too agitated to speak. I was awful agitated too. Our silver-mounted spectacles met each other in a last glance of noble, firm-principled sadness, and so Horace and I parted away from each other. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of My Opinions and Betsey Bobbet's by Mrs. Josiah Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Sea Voyage. After I left Horace, I hastened on, for I was afraid I was behind time. Being a large, hefty woman, my weight is 210 pounds by the steelyards now, I could not hasten as in former days when I weighed 100 pounds less. I was also encumbered with my umbrella, my satchel bag, my cap box, and What I Know About Farming. But I hastened on with what speed I might. But alas! my apprehensions was too true, the cars had gone. What was to be done? Betsey sat on her portmantea at the depot, looking so gloomy and depressed that I knew that I could not depend on her for succor. I must rely unto myself. There are minutes that try the soul, and show what timber it is built of. Not one trace of the wild storm of emotions that was raging inside of me could be traced on my firm brow, as Betsey looked up in a gloomy way and says, "What are we going to do now?" No, I rose nobly to meet the occasion, and said in a voice of marble calm, "I don't know, Betsey." Then I sot down, for I was beat out. Betsey looked wild. Says she, "Josiah Allen's wife, I am sick of earth. The cold, heartless ground looks hollow to me. I feel just reckless enough to dare the briny deep." Says she, in a bold, darin' way, "Le's go home on the canal." The canal boat run right by our house, and though at first I hung back in my mind, thinking that Josiah would never consent to have me face the danger of the deep in the dead of the night, still the thought of stayin' in New York village another night made me waver. And I thought to myself, if Josiah knew just how it was, the circumstances environin' us all round, and if he considered that my board bill would cost $3 more if I stayed another night, I felt that he would consent, though it seemed perilous and almost hazardous in us. So I wavered and wavered. Betsey see me waver and took advantage of it, and urged me almost warmly. but I didn't give my consent in a minute. I am one that calmly weighs any great subject or understandin' in the balances. Says I, Betsey, have you considered the danger? Says I, the shore we was born on may sometimes seem tame to us, but safety is there. Says I, more freedom may be upon the deep waters, but it is a treacherous element. Says I never attempted its perils in my life, only on a bridge. Nor I neither, says she, but she added in still more despairin' tones, what do I care for danger? What if it is a treacherous element? What have I got to live for in this desert life? And then, says she, the captain of a boat here is mother's cousin. He would let us go cheap. Says I in awful deep tones of principle, I have got Josiah to live for, and the great cause of right and the children, and I feel for their sakes that I ought not to rush into danger. But again I thought of my board bill, and again I felt that Josiah would give his consent for me to take the voyage. Betsey had been to the village with her father on the canal, and she knew the way, and suffice it to say, as the sun descended into his gory bed in the west, its last light shone onto Betsey and me a-settin' in the contracted cabin of the canal boat. We were the only females on board, and if it hadn't been for Betsey's bein' his relation, we couldn't have embarked, for the bark was heavily laden. The evening after we embarked, the boat sailin' at the time under the pressure of 2 miles an hour, a storm began to come up. I didn't say nothin', but I wished I was ashore. The rain came down, the thunder roared in the distance, the wind howled at us. I felt sad. I thought of Josiah. As the storm increased, Betsey looked out of the window, and says she, Josiah Allen's wife, we are surrounded by dangers. One of the horses has got the heaves. Can you not hear him above the wild roar of the tempest? And one of them is balky. I know it. And lifting her gloomy eyes to the ceilin' so I couldn't see much of 'em but the whites, says she, look at the stovepipe. See it sway in the storm. A little heavy a blast will unhinge it. And what a night it would be for pirates to be abroad and give chase to us. But, she continued, my soul is in unison with the wild fury of the elements. I feel like warbling one of the wild sea odes of old, and she began to sing, my name is Robert Kidd, as I sailed, oh, my name is Robert Kidd, as I sailed. She sung it right through. I should say by my feelin's it took her nigh onto an hour, though my sufferin's I know blinded me and made my calculations of time less to be depended on than a clock. She sang it through once, and then she began it again. She got as far the second time as this, my name is Robert Kidd, and so wickedly I did, as I sailed, oh, so wickedly I did, as I sailed. The cabin was dark, only lit by one kerosene lamp, with a chimbley dark with the smoke of years. Her voice was awful. The tune was awful. I stood it as long as I could seemingly, and says I, in agitated tones, I wouldn't sing any more, Betsey, if I was in your place. Alas! Better it would have been for my peace of mind had I let her sing. For although she stopped the piece with a wild quaver that made me tremble, she spoke right up, and says she, my soul seems mountain up and in sympathy with the scene. My spirit is soarin' and must have vent. Josiah Allen's wife, have you any objections to my writin' a poem? I have got 7 sheets of paper in my portmanty. The spirit of my forefathers rose up in me, and says I firmly, "When I come into the deep, I come expectin' to face trouble. I am prepared for it," says I. "A few verses more or less hain't a-goin' to overthrow my principles." She sot down by the table and began to take off her toe curls and frizzles. I should think by a careless estimate that there was a 6-quart pan full. And then she went to untwistin' her own hair, which was done up at the backside of her head in a little nubbin about as big as 1/2 a sweet walnut. Says she, "I always let down my hair and take out my teeth when I write poetry. I feel more free and sawing in my mind." Says she in a sort of apology way, "Genius is full of eccentricities that seem strange to the world's people." Says I, calmly, "You can let down and take out all you want to. I can stand it." But it was a fearful scene. It was a night never to be forgot while memory sets up on the high chair of my mind. Outside the rain poured down. Overhead on deck the wind shrieked at the bags and boxes, threatening 'em with almost an instant destruction. The stovepipe that run up through the floor shook as if every blast would unjint it, and then the thought would rise up, though I tried to put it out of my head, who would put it up again? One of the horses was bulky, I knew, for I could hear the driver swear at him. And every time he swore, I thought of Josiah, and it kept him in my mind most all the time. Yes, the storm almost raved outside, and inside a still more depressin' and fearful sight to me. Betsey Bobbet sot with her few locks streamin' over her pale and holler cheeks, for her teeth was out, and she wrote rapidly, and I knew, just as well as I know my name is Josiah Allen's wife, that I had got to hear 'em read. Oh, the anguish of that night! I thought of the happy people on shore, in their safe and peaceful feather beds, and then on the treacherous element I was a-ridin' on, and then I thought of Josiah. Sometimes mockin' fancy would so mock at me that I could almost fancy that I heard him snore. But no, cold reality told me that it was only the heavy horse, or the wind a-blowin' through the stovepipe, and then I would rouse up to the agonizing thought that I was at sea, far, far from home and Josiah. And then a solemn voice would sometimes make itself heard in my soul, "Maybe you'll never hear him snore agin." And then I would sigh heavily, and the driver on the towpath would loudly curse that dangerous animal, and the wind would howl round the boxes, and the stovepipe would rattle, and Betsey would write poetry rapidly, and I knew I had got to hear it. And so the tedious night wore away. Finally, at 2:30, wore out as I was with fatigue and wakefulness, Betsey ceased writin', and says she, "It is done. I will read them to you." I sighed so deeply that even Betsey almost trembled, and says she, "Are you in pain, Josiah Allen's wife?" Says I, "Only in my mind." "Wall," says she, "it is indeed a fearful time. But somehow my soul exults strangely in the perils environing us. I feel like courtin' and keepin' company with danger to-night. I feel as if I could almost dare to mount that steed wildly careering along the towpath, if I only had a side saddle. I feel like rushin' into danger. I feel reckless to-night." Here the driver swore fearfully, and, still more appallin' sight to me, Betsey opened her paper and commenced readin'. Betsey's Sea Poem. Stanzas written on the Deep, by Betsey Bobbet. The ground seems hollow unto me, men's vests but mask deep perfidy. My life has towered so hard and steep, I seek the wild and raging deep. Such gnawing pains my soul doth rack, that even the wild horse on the track doth madly prance and snort and leap. Welcome the horrors of the deep. Oh, Jonesville, on that peaceful shore, methinks I'll see thy towers no more. When morn wakes happy, thoughtless sheep, Betsey may slumber in the deep. If far from thee my bones are doomed, in these dark waves to be entombed, mermaids, I hope, will o'er her weep, who drowned was within the deep. Dear augur, hopes in ruin lays. My Ebenezer I could not raise. Dear lost gazelles, I can but weep, with gloomy eyes bent o'er the deep. One slimpsy star, whose name is Simon, still twinkles faint, like a small-sized diamond. O star of hope, I sithe, I weep, thou shinest so faint across the deep. There was between 20 and 30 verses of 'em, but truly it is always the darkest just before daylight, for as she was a-readin' of 'em, I, a-leanin' back on my chair, dropped off to sleep and forgot my trouble. Betsey also went to sleep before she read the last of 'em, and when I waked up, the boat had stopped in front of our house, the wind had gone down, the sun was a-shinin', and Josiah was comin' down to the bank. The danger was all past. Home and Josiah was mine again. I grasped holt of his hand as he helped me get off, and in a voice tremulous with feelin's I could not control, I said, "I have got home, Josiah. Is breakfast ready?" There was a tenderness in his tone and a happy smile on his face that reminded me of the sweet days of our courtship, as he answered me in a tone almost husky with emotion, "Yes, Samantha, all but settin' the table." Says I'm glad of it, for I'm dreadful hungry. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of My Opinions and Betsey Bobbet's by Mrs. Josiah Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Old Friends in New Garments. It was a lovely Monday forenoon, some 3 or 4 weeks after my voyage. I was a-sittin' near the open back door, enjoyin' the pleasant prospect, and also washin' some new potatoes for dinner. Truly it was a fair scene. The feathered hens was a-singin' in their innocent joy as they scratched the yieldin' turf after bugs and worms. Old Hail the Day was proudly struttin' round, standin' first on one foot and then on the other, and crowin' joyfully in his careless freedom and glee. The breezes blew sweetly from the west, and I thought with joy that my clothes on the clothesline would be ready to iron by the time I got dinner out of the way. The sun shone down out of a blue and cloudless sky, and I looked pensively at my green gages, and thought fondly how the sun was a-ripenin' 'em. All nature was peaceful and serene, and my mind as I gently scraped the large fair potatoes, and thought how good they was a-goin' to be with the baked lamb I had got in the oven, was as peaceful and serene as the same. Suddenly I heard the gate click to, and I saw old Mr. Bobbet comin' up to the house. He seemed dreadfully agitated, and I could hear him talkin' to himself. He came right into the door, and took his hat off in one hand, holdin' his crooked cane in the other, and swingin' 'em both over his head to once, and says he, "It's done! It's done!" "What's done?" says I, droppin' my knife onto the floor. "Betsey's gone!" shouted he, and he run out the door like a loony. I was a-most scart to death, and remained motionless nigh onto a minute, when I heard Josiah comin' in. Little did I dream what a blow was comin' on to me. He came and stood right in front of me, and I thought at the time he looked at me dreadful curious, but I kep' on a-scrapin' my potatoes. I had got 'em most done. Finally, all at once Josiah spoke up, and says he, "Betsey Bobbet is married." I dropped the pan of potatoes right down onto the floor, for I was as weak as a weak white cat. Who? Josiah Allen, who is the man?"
"Simon Slimpsy," says he. "They was married last night, as I was comin' by the old cider mill."
"I see all through it," says I mournfully. "He and 7 or 8 of his children have been sick, and Betsey would go and take care of 'em."
"Yes," says Josiah, "as I was comin' past the old cider mill."
Says I with spirit, "It ought to be looked into. He was a helpless old man, and she has took the advantage of him." I went on warmly, for I thought of his gloomy forebodins, and I always felt for the oppressed and imposed upon. I had went on, I presume as much as 2 minutes and a half, when Josiah, says he,
"I wouldn't take on so about it, Samantha. Anybody to hear you talk would think you was a perfect farrago."
Says I, "If I was a goin' to abuse my wife and call her names, I would do it accordin' to grammar. You mean vertigo, Josiah."
"Well, I said vertigo, didn't I?"
Josiah never will own that he is in the wrong.
"And I didn't say you was a vertigo, Samantha, only anybody would take you for a vertigo that didn't know you."
I remained almost lost in sad thoughts for pretty nigh half a minute, and then I says in mournful tones, "Have you heard any of the particulars, Josiah? Have you seen any of the relatives? Is the old man any more reconciled to the last?"
"Yes," says Josiah, "as I was comin' by the old cider mill—"
"Well, do, for conscience sake, come by the old cider mill and be done with it," says I, feelin' worried out in my mind, and by the side of myself.
"How can I be goin' to get by, Samantha? You are so aggravatin'. You never let me finish a story peaceable, and I should think it was about dinner time."
"So 'tis," says I, soothin'ly, hangin' on the tea kettle and puttin' the potatoes over the stove in the summer kitchen. For a long and arduous study of the sect has convinced me that good victuals are more healin' than oil to pour onto a man's lacerated feelin's. And the same deep study has warned me never to get mad at the same time Josiah does. On these 2 great philosophical laws hangs all the harmony of married life. Then I stepped out onto the stoop again, and says to him in calm, affectionate accents, "What is it about the old cider mill, Josiah?"
"Nothin'," says he, "only I met one of the first mourners, I mean one of old Slimpsy's sisters there, and she told me about it. She said that since the editor of the Auger was married, and since Betsey had got back from New York, she had acted like a wild critter. She seemed to think it was now or never. The awful doom of not bein' married at all seemed to fall upon her and craze her with wild horror. And findin' Slimpsy, who was a weak sort of a man anyway, and doubly weakened now by age and inflammatory rheumatism, she went and took care of him and got the upper hand of him, made him a victim and married him at his own house Sunday night at 7:30. I was so lost in sorrowful thought as Josiah continued the mournful tale, that Josiah says in a soothin' tone, "You ought to try to be reconciled to it, Samantha. It seems to be the Lord's will that she should marry him."
"I don't believe in layin' every mean low-lived thing to the Lord, Josiah. I lay this to Betsey Bobbet." And I again plunged down into gloomy thought, and was roused only by his concludin' words, "Seems to me, Samantha, you might have a few griddle cakes. The bread, I see this mornin', was gettin' kinder dry." Mechanically I complied with his request, for my thoughts wasn't there, they was with the afflicted and downtrodden. 1 week after this, I was goin' up the post office steps, and I come face to face with Simon Slimpsy. He had grown 23 years older during the past week, but he is a shiftless, harmless critter,
hurtin' himself more'n anybody else. He was naturally a small-boned man. In the prime of his manhood he might have come up to Betsey's shoulders, but now, withered by age and grief, the highest hat was futile to bring him much above her belt ribbon. He looked sad indeed. My heart bled for him. But with the instinctive delicacy inherent to my sect, I put on a jocular tone, and says I, as I shook hands with him, "How do you do, Simon? I hain't seen you before since you was married, Simon Slimpsy." He looked at me almost wildly in the face, and says he, in a despairin' tone, "I knew it would come to this, Miss Allen. I knew it. I told you how it would be. You know I did. She always said it was her spear to marry. I knew I should be the one. I always was the one." "Don't she use you well, Simon Slimpsy?" "She is pretty hard on me," says he. "I hain't had my way in anything since the day she married me. She begun to hold my nose to the grindstone, as the saying is, before we had been married 2 hours. And she hain't no housekeeper nor cook. I have had to live on pancakes most of the time since it took place, and they are tougher than leather. I have been most tempted to cut some out of my bootlegs to see if they wouldn't be tenderer, but I never should hear the end of it if I did. She jaws me awfully and orders me round as if I was a dog, a yeller dog," he added despairingly. "If I was a yeller dog, she couldn't seem to look down on me any more, and treat me any worse." Says I always did mistrust these women that talk so much about not wantin' any rights, and clingin', and so forth. But, says I, not wantin' to run anybody to their backs, she thought it was her spear to marry. "I told you," says he in agonizin' tones, "I told you that spear of hern would destroy me, and it has." He looked so sorrowful that I says to him, in still more jocular tones than I had yet used, "Chirk up, Simon Slimpsy, I wish you joy." I felt that he needed it indeed. He gave me an awful look that was just about half reproach and half anguish, and I see a tear begin to flow. I turned away respectin' his feelin's. As he went down the steps slowly, I see him put his hands in his pockets, as if searchin' for his handkerchief, seemin'ly in vain. But he had on a long blue broadcloth swallow-tailed coat that he was married in the first time, long years ago, and as he went round the corner he took up the skirts of his coat and wiped his eyes. I said to myself with a deep sigh, "And this is woman's only spear." And the words awakened in my breast as many as 19 or 20 different emotions, and I don't know but more. I murmured musingly to myself, "It seems to me, if I was a woman, I should about as lives be a constable." While I was still musin', Betsey, his wife, tore down the street in a distracted way and paused before me. "Have you seen my husband?" says she. "Can you tell a distracted wife? Have you ever seen her husband, Simon Slimpsy?" She looked wild, as if she feared a catastrophe, and she cried out, loosin' hold of her self-control, in a firm, constable-like tone, "He shall not escape me. I will telegraph to the next station house. I will have the creek dragged. The woods shall be scoured out," says she. "Be calm and compose yourself," says I frigidly. "Simon Slimpsy has gone up towards his house." She heaved a deep sigh of content, and triumph again brooded down upon her eyebrow as she follered on after him. I hadn't no idee of callin' on her. I wouldn't, but the next day Simon Slimpsy went by on his old white horse.
It is a very dejected-looking horse in the face, besides carrying a couple of washboards on its sides, in the line of ribs. Thomas Jefferson says, "What gives it its mournful expression? It is mournin' for the companions of its youth." Says he, "You know Noah saved a pair of everything." And says he, "His poor companion passed away several thousand years ago." That boy worries me. I don't know what he is comin' to. Slimpsy's old horse hain't more'n 35 or 40 years old, I don't believe. They say Betsey is makin' a pale blue cambric ridin' dress, and is goin' to ride him a horseback this fall. It don't seem to me there would be much fun in it, he is so lame, besides havin' a habit of fallin' frequently with the blind staggers. Howsomever, it's none of my business. But as I was sayin', I stood silently in the door to see old Slimpsy go by a horseback, and I thought to myself as I pensively turned out my tea grounds, I was a-gettin' dinner, how much it looks like a nightmare that has broke out of its lawful night pastures and is running away with a pale and harassed victim. So haggard and melancholy did they both look. And I sithed. I hadn't much more'n got through sithin' when he rode up, and says he, "The 7th boy is worse, and the twin girls are took down with it. It would be a melancholy pleasure, Miss Allen, if you could go up." I went. Betsey had got the most of 'em to sleep, and was settin' between a few cradles, and trundle beds, and high chairs all filled with measles, and a few mumps. Betsey's teeth was out, and her toe frizzles lay on the table with a lot of paper, so I mistrusted she had been a-writin' a poem. But she was now engaged in mendin' a pair of pantaloons, the 8th pair, she told me, she had mended that day, for Simon Slimpsy was a poor man and couldn't afford to buy new ones. They was a hard and mournful looking pair, and says I to her, in a tone in which pity and contempt was blended about half and half, "Betsey, are you happy?" "I am at rest," says she, "more at rest than I have been for years." "Are you happy?" says I, lookin' keenly at her. "I feel real dignified," says she. "There isn't no use in a woman trying to be dignified till she is married, for she can't. I have tried it, and I know. I can truly say, Josiah Allen's wife, that I never knew what dignity was until 1 week ago last Sunday night at 7:30 in the evenin'," says she, turnin' over the pantaloons, and attacked in a ghastly hole of about 7 by 9 dimensions in the left knee. I sot silently in my chair like a statute while she remarked thus, and as she paused, I says to her agin, fixin' my mild but stern gray eyes upon her weary form bendin' over the dilapidated folds of the 8th, "Are you happy, Betsey?" "I have got something to lean on," says she. I thought of the fragile form bendin' over the lean and haggard horse, and totterin' away withered by age and grief in the swallow-tailed coat, and says I, in a pitying accent, "Don't lean too hard, Betsey." "Why?" says she. Says I, in a kind of a blind way, "You may be sorry if you do." And then I says to her in clear and piercin' accents these words, "Do you love your husband, Betsey?" "I don't think love is necessary," says she. "I am married, which is enough to satisfy any woman who is more or less reasonable. That is the main and important thing. And as I have said, love and respect and so forth are minors as—" "Minors!" says I, in a tone of deep indignity. "Minors! Betsey Bobbet, Mrs. Betsey Bobbet Slimpsy," says she, correctin' of me proudly, as she attacked at another mournful looking hole as big as my 2 hands.
Well, Betsy Slimpsy, says I, beginnin' again, and wavin' my right hand in a eloquent wave. There hain't no more beautiful sight on earth than to see two human souls, out of pure love to each other, gently approachin' each other as if they must. And at last all their hopes and thoughts and affections runnin' in together, so you can't separate 'em nohow, just like two drops of rainwater in a mornin' glory blow. And to see 'em nestlin' there, not carin' for nobody outside the blow, contented and bound up in each other till the sun evaporates 'em, as it were, and draws 'em up together into the heaven, not separatin' of 'em up there, why, such a marriage as that is a sight that does men and angels good to look at. But when a woman sells herself, swaps her purity, her self-respect, her truth, and her soul, for barter of any kind, such as a house and lot, a few $1,000s, the name of bein' married, a horse and buggy, some jewelry, and etcetery, and not only sells herself, but, worse than the Turk women, goes round herself, huntin' up a buyer, crazy, wild-eyed, afraid she won't find none. When she does find one, suppose she does have a minister for salesman, my contempt for that female is unmitigable." Betsy still looked so wrapped up in dignity, as she bravely attacked the seat of another pair of trousers, that it fairly made me mad. Instead of that proud and triumphant mien, I wanted her to look some stricken, and I resumed in a tone of indignity, almost burnin' enough to set fire to her apron, "Nor I don't want these women that have sold themselves for a certificate with a man's name on it. I don't want to hear 'em talk about infamy. Hain't they infamous themselves? What have they done different from those other bad women, only they have got a stiddy place and a little better wages, such as respectability in the eyes of fools and etcetery. Do you suppose that a woman standin' up in front of a minister and tellin' a few pesky lies, such as, 'I promise to love a man I hate and respect a man that hain't respectable, and honor and obey a man I calculate to make toe the mark,' do you suppose these few lies makes her any purer in the eyes of God than if she had sold herself without tellin' 'em, as the other infamous women did? Not any. Marriage is like baptism, as I have said more'n 100 times. You have got to have the inward grace and the outward form to make it lawful and right. What good does the water do if your soul hain't baptized with the love of God? It hain't no better than fallin' into the creek." I paused, spotted in the face from conflictin' emotions, and Betsy begun in a haughty, triumphant tone, "Woman spia," which words and tone combined with recollections of the aged sufferer in the blue swallow-tailed coat, so worked on my indignation, that I walked out of the house without listenin' to another word, and put on my bunnet out in the dooryard. But I hollered back to her from the bars, for Josiah Allen's wife hain't one to desert duty in any crisis, that the 4 youngest boys ought to be swet and take some saffron tea, and I should give the 5 girls and the twins some catnip, and I'd let the rest of 'em be till the doctor come. I hain't seen Betsy since, for she is havin' a hard time of it. She has to work like a dog. For Simon Slimpsy bein' so poor and not bein' no calculator, it makes it hard for 'em to get along. And the old man seems to have lost what little energy he had since he was married. Betsy is so hard on him. He has the horrors awfully. Betsy takes in work, but they have a hard time to get along. Miss Gowdy says that Betsy told her that she didn't mind workin' so hard, but she did hate to give up writin' poetry, but she didn't get no time for it. So, as is generally the case, a great good to the world has come out of her sufferin'. I guess she hain't wrote but one piece since she was married, and they was wrote, I suppose, the day I catched her with her teeth out, for they come out in the next week's Gimlet, for just as quick as the editor of the Auger was married, Betsey changed her politics and wrote again as formally for the Gimlet. The following are some of the verses she wrote. I am married now. A Hymn of Victory by Mrs. Betsey Slimpsey, nee Bobbet. Fate, I defy thee. I have vanquished thee, old maid. Dost ask why thus this proud triumphant brow? I answer thee, old Fate, with loud and joyful burst of blissful laughter, I am married now. Once grief did rave about my lonely head. Once I did droop as droops a drooping willow bough. Once I did tune my lyre to doleful strains. 'Tis past, my soul, I am married now. Then, sneering, venomed darts pierced my lone heart. Then, mocking married fingers dragged me low. But now I tune my lyre to sweet, ecstatic strains. My tears have all been shed, I am married now. No gossip lean can wound me by her speech. I no humiliatin' never more shall know. Sorrow, stand off, I am beyond thy ghastly reach, for Mrs. Betsey Slimpsey, formerly Bobbet, is married now. O mournful past, when I in Injun file climbed single life's bleak, rocky mountain's brow, blessed lot, that unto wedlock's glorious glade hath led me, Betsey's married now. O female hearts with anxious longings stirred, cry ho for women's spear and seal it with a vow. Take Mrs. Betsey Bobbet Slimpsey's word that thou shalt triumph, I am married now. Yes, Betsey's married, sweet to meditate upon it, to tune my happy lyre with haughty, laughing brow, to these sweet, glorious words, the burden of my sonnet, that Mrs. Betsey Bobbet Slimpsey's married now. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of My Opinions and Betsey Bobbet's by Mrs. Josiah Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Horace and Josiah. When the news came to me that Horace Greeley was dead, I almost cried. The tears did just run down my face like rainwater. I don't know when I have come nearer cryin' than I did then. And my first thought was, they have tried awful hard to keep him out of the White House, but he has got into one whiter than any they have got in Washington, D.C. And then my very next thought was, Josiah Allen's wife, did you say anything to hurt that man's feelin's when you was a-trying to influence him on your tower? I believe if folks would only realize how every harsh word and cold look they stab lovin' hearts with, would just turn round like bayonets and pierce their own heart in a time like this, they would be more careful how they handled 'em. But glad enough was I to think that I didn't say a hard word to him, but had freed my mind and told him just how good I thought he was, and how much he had done for the black African and the human race, before it was too late. Glad enough was I that I didn't wait till that noble heart was cold and lifeless, and couldn't be pained by unkindness, or made gladder by sympathy, before I gin him mine. But in the time of trouble, the love that had been his best reward for all the successes of his hard work in life, had gone from him. And I know just how that great heart ached for that love and sympathy. I know just how poor the praise of the world would have looked to him, if he couldn't have seen it a-shinin' through them lovin' eyes, and how hard it was for him to bear its blame alone. Tired out, defeated, the world called him, but he only had to fold his hands and shut his eyes up, and he was crowned with success in that world where he, who was once rejected by a majority, crowned with thorns of earthly defeat, waits now to give the crown of eternal repose to all true souls, all the weary warriors on life's battlefield who give their lives for the right. And it seemed so kinder beautiful, too, to think that before he loved so hardly had time to feel strange in them many mansions, he was with her again, and they could keep house together all through eternity. Yet, though, as I say, I don't know when I have come so near cryin' as I did then, I said to myself as I wiped my eyes on my apron, I wouldn't call him back from that happy rest he had earned so well if I could. But there are other things that are worrisome to me and make me a sight of trouble. It was a day or two after this, and I was settin' alone, for Josiah had gone to mill, and Thomas Jefferson and Maggie Snow and Tirzah Ann and Whitfield Minkley had gone a sleigh ridin'. Them two affairs is in a flourishin' condition, and it is very agreeable to Josiah and me, though I make no matches nor break none, or that is, I don't make none only by talkin' in a encouragin' manner, nor break none only with thorowert in a mild way. I sot all alone a cuttin' carpet rags, and a musin' sadly. Victory in jail! And though I felt that she richly deserved it, and I should liked to have shut her up myself in our sullar way for darin' to slander Beecher, still, to me who knows her sect so well, it seemed kinder hard that a woman should be where she couldn't go a visitin'. And then to think the good talkin' to I give her when she was on my tower hadn't amounted to nothin' seeminly. I wasn't sorry I had labored with her, not a mite. I had did my duty anyway. And I knew just as well as I know that my name was formally Smith, that when anybody is a workin' in the cause of right, they hadn't ought to be discouraged if they didn't get their pay down, for you can't sow your seeds and pick your posies the same day anyway. And I know that great idees was enough sight harder to get rooted and a-growin' than the century plant, and that takes 100 years for it to blow out. I know all this, but human natur gets kinder tired a waitin', and there seems no end to the snows that lay between us and that summer that all earnest souls are a-workin' for. And then I want my sect to do right. I want 'em to be real respectable, and I felt that, take Victory altogether, she wasn't a ornament to it. I thought of my sect, and then I thought of Victory, and then I sithed. Beecher a bein' lied about, Tilton ditto and the same, for you see I don't nor won't believe what Victory says against 'em, although they don't come out and deny the truth of it, either of 'em, just to satisfy some folks who say that they ought to, Miss Anthony havin' a hard tussle of it at Rochester. Whitfield Minkley had told me too that day that Miss Astor didn't keep tavern herself, and there I had had all my trouble about her for nothin', demeanin' myself by offerin' to wash dishes for I know not who. And to think that Jonathan Beans's ex-wife should have deceived me so, when I befriended her so much when she first went to grass. And then, when I thought how all the good advice I had given Victory hadn't done her no good, and how Mr. Greeley had died before the seeds I sowed in his bosom on the great question of women's rights had sprouted and brought forth fruit, when I see my tower had been in vain, say nothin' of the money it cost, oh, how holler the world looked to me! It almost seemed as if it would break in and let me through, rockin' chair and all. As I sot there amusin' over it, and a-cuttin' my rags, I almost made up my mind that I would have the dark stripe in my carpet black as a coal, the hole on it, a sort of mournin' stripe. but better feelin's got up inside of my mind, and I felt that I would put in my butternut color rather than waste it. Yet, oh, how holler and unstiddy everything looked to me. Who could I trust? Whose apron string could I cling to without expectin' it would break off short with me? For pretty nigh 2 minutes and a half, I had the horrors almost as bad as Simon Slimpsy. He has 'em now every day stiddy, Betsey is so hard on him. But oh, how sweetly in that solemn time there came to me the thought of Josiah. Yes, on that worrisome time, I can truly say that Josiah Allen was my theme, and I thought to myself, there may be handsomer men than he is, and men that weigh more by the steelyards, but there hain't one to be found that has heftier morals, or more well-seasoned principles than he has. Yes, Josiah Allen was my theme. I felt that I could trust my Josiah. I guess I had got musin' again on jails and wickedness, and so forth, for all of a sudden the thought knocked against my heart, what if Josiah Allen should go to cuttin' up and behavin'? I wouldn't let the thought in. I ordered it out. But it kep' a-hangin' round. What if your Josiah Allen should go to cuttin' up? I argued with it. Says I to myself, I guess I know Josiah Allen, a likelier man never trod shoe leather. I know him like a book. But then thinkses I, what strange critters men and women be. Now you may live with one for years, and think you know every crook and turn in that critter's mind just like a book, when lo and behold, all of a sudden a leaf will be turned over that had been glued together by some circumstance or other, and there will be readin' that you never set eyes on before. Sometimes it is in an unknown tongue, sometimes it is good readin', and then again it is bad. Oh, how gloomy and depressed I was. But Josiah's wife hain't one to give up to the horrors without a tussle. And though inwardly so tossed it about, I rose up, and with a brow of calm, I sought my basket of carpet rags behind the door, and quietly put on the tea kettle, for it was about time for Josiah to come. Then I looked round to see if there was anything I could do to make it look more pleasant than it did for Josiah Allen when he came home cold and tired from the Jonesville mill. It never was my way to stand stunned still in the middle of the floor and smile at him from half to 3/4 of an hour. Yet it was always my idee that if a woman can't make home the pleasantest spot in the world for her husband, she needn't complain if he won't stay there any more than he can help. I believe there wouldn't be so many men a-meanderin' off nights into grog shops and all sorts of wickedness, if they had a bright home and a cheerful companion to draw 'em back. Not but what men have to be corrected occasionally. I have to correct Josiah every little while. But, good land, it is all I can do to get Josiah Allen and Thomas Jefferson out of the house long enough to mop. I looked round the room, as I said, but not a thing did I see that I could alter for the better. It was slick as a pin. The painted floor was a-shinin' like yaller glass. I had mopped just before dinner. The braided mats, mostly red and green, was a-layin' smooth and clean in front of the looking-glass and before the stove and table. 2 or 3 pictures that Thomas Jefferson had framed hung up against the wall, which was papered with a light-colored buff groundwork with a red rose on it. The lounge and 2 or 3 rockin' chairs was cushioned with handsome copper plate. And Tirzah Ann had got a hangin' basket of ivy on the west winder that made that winder look like summer. I'll bet her canary hangin' there in the thickest of the green leaves thought it was summer. He sang like it. The stove hearth shone like a silver dollar, and there was a bright fire, and in a minute the tea kettle began to sing most as loud as Whitey, that is her canary's name. I mistrust she named it in that kinder underhanded way after Whitfield Minkley, though I never let her know I mistrusted it, but I never could think of any other earthly reason why she should call it Whitey, for it was as yeller as any goslin I ever laid eyes on. I felt that I couldn't alter a thing round the house for the better. But as I happened to glance up into the lookin'-glass, I see that although I looked well, my hair was slick and I had on a clean gingham dress, my brown and black plaid, still I felt that if I should pin on one of Tirzah Ann's bows that lay on the little shelf under the lookin'-glass, I might look more cheerful and pleasant in the eyes of my companion, Josiah. I hain't made a practice of wearin' bows since I jined the meetin' house. And then again, I felt that I was too old to wear 'em. Not that I felt bad 'bout growin' old. If it was best for us to have summer all the year round, I know we should have it. As I have said to Josiah Allen more'n once when he got kinder downhearted, says I, Josiah Allen, look up where the stars are shinin', and tell me if you think that with all them countless worlds, with all that wealth in his hands and his lovin' heart, the Lord begrudges anything that is for his children's good. No, I am willin' to take God's year as it comes, summer and winter. And then do you s'pose I would if I could, by turnin' my hand over, go back into my youth again and leave Josiah part way downhill alone? No, the sunshine and the mornin' are on the other side of the hill, and we are goin' down into the shadders, my pardner Josiah and me. But we will go like Mr. and Mrs. Joseph John that Tirzah Ann sings about. Hand in hand we'll go, and we'll sleep together at the foot, knowing that beyond them shadders is the sunshine of God's great mornin'. As I said, I don't make a practice of wearin' bows, and this bein' fire red, I should have felt a awful backslidin' feelin' about wearin' it, if I hadn't felt that principle was upholdin' me. Then I drawed out the table and put on a clean white tablecloth and begun to set it. I had some good bread and butter. I had baked that day, and my bread was white as snow and light as day, some canned peaches, and some thin slices of ham as pink as a rose, and a strawberry pie. One of my cans had bust that day, and I made 'em up into pies. And then I brought up some of my very best cake, such as I keep for company, fruit cake and delicate cake. And then after I had put on a great piece of white honey in a glass dish, and some cheese that was like cream for richness, the table looked well. I had got the table all set, and had just opened the door to see if he was a comin', when, lo and behold, there he stood on the doorstep. He had come and put his horses out before I see him. He looked awful depressed, and before he got the snow half off'n his boots, says he, "That new whip I bought the other day is gone, Samantha. Some feller stole it while I was gettin' my grist ground." Says I, "Josiah, I have been amusin' on the unsteadiness and wickedness of the world all day, and now that whip is gone. What is the world a-comin' to, Josiah Allen?" Josiah is a man that don't say much, but things wear on him. His face looked several inches longer than it usually did, and he answered in a awful depressed tone, "I don't know, Samantha, but I do know that I am as hungry as a bear." "Well," says I soothingly, "I thought you would be. Supper's all on the table." He stepped in, and the very minute that men catched sight of that cheerful room and that supper table, that man smiled. And it wasn't a sickly, deathly smile either. It was a smile of deep inward joy and contentment. And says he in a sweet tone, "It seems to me that you have got a awful good supper tonight, Samantha." As I see that smile and looked into that honest, beamin' face,
I just turned out them gloomy forebodin's about him out of my heart, the whole caboodle of 'em, and shut the door in their faces. But I controlled my voice till it sounded like a perfect stranger to me, and says I, "Don't I always get good suppers, Josiah Allen?"
"Yes," says he, "and good dinners and breakfasts too. I will say this for you, Samantha, there hain't a better cook in Jonesville than you be, nor a woman that makes a pleasanter home."
And he went on placidly, as he stood there with his back to the fire a-warmin' him, a-lookin' serenely round that bright, warm room, and onto that supper table,
"There hain't no place quite so good as home, is there, Samantha? Hain't supper about ready?"
Says I, firmly, "The cause of right and the good of the human race will ever be dear to the soul of her who was formerly Samantha Smith. But at the same time, that don't hinder me from thinkin' a sight of my home, and from gettin' good suppers. It will be ready, Josiah, just as quick as the tea is steeped. I didn't want to make it till you come, for bilin' just spiles that last tea you got." And I went on in tomes as firm as Plymouth Rock, yet as tender as a spring chicken. "As I have said more'n 100 times, if it is spelt right, there hain't another such a word as home in the English language. The French can't spell it at all, and in my opinion that is just what makes 'em so light-minded and unstiddy. If it is spelt wrong, as in the case of Bobbet and Slimpsy, it means the horrors and the very worst kinds of discomfort and misery. In fact, love is the only schoolmaster that can put out that word worth a cent. And if it is put out by him, and spelt, for instance, by a couple who have loved each other for goin' on 15 years, with a firm and almost cast-iron affection, why, it stands for peace and rest and comfort, and is the plainest picture God has give us below, kinder as we put painted pictures in children's story books, of that great home above, where the colors won't never rub off the picture, and the peace and the rest are everlasting." I had been real eloquent, I knew it, and Josiah knew it, for that man looked awful kinder earnest and serene like. He was silent for maybe half or 3/4 of a minute, and then he said in calm, gentle tones, "I guess I'll carry the grist upstairs before supper, Samantha, and have it done with." There hain't a lazy hair in that man's head, and for that matter there hain't many of any kind, either smart or shiftless. He grows bald every day, not that I blame him for it. He came downstairs, and we sot down to the table, happy as a king and queen, for all the old world was a caperin' and cuttin' up as if it would go crazy. The little black slidin' feelin' about wearin' that fire-red bow died away too, as ever and anon, and I don't know but oftener, I would look up and catch the eye of my companion Josiah bent on me in a pleasant and sort of a admirin' way. That bow was becomin' to me, I knew, for as Josiah passed me his cup for his second cup of tea, no dishwatery stuff, I can tell you, he says, "I don't see what makes you look so young and handsome tonight, Samantha. I believe I shall have to go a-courtin' you over again." And I answered him in the same agreeable accents, "I didn't know as the law could touch you for it, Josiah, if you did." End of chapter 30. End of My Opinions and Betsey Bobbet's, designed as a beacon light to guide women to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but which may be read by members of the sterner sect without injury to themselves or the book, by Mrs. Josiah Allen.